Star of the Unborn. The 23rd chapter. Wherein the episode of the previous chapter continues in the daisy fields and I stray into forbidden byways that lead me to the turnip mannequins, to the catabolites, and finally to the Nemodrome, the lake of Dremembrance. Perhaps my salvation down here in the Wintergarten lay in the fact that the 26-odd trillion cells of my reconstructed body belong to some other eon than the 11th cosmic capital year of Virgo. I don't know whether the word allergic is appropriate in this connection, but since everybody else uses it, I'll risk it too. I proved allergic to retrogenesis, to retrovolution. While BH, astromental citizen that he was, had not been able to resist and hadn't even wanted to, all the 26 trillion cells constituting me, a visitor from the primeval world, revolted against a process that was alien and odious to my nature. I am quite convinced that my body was not retrovolutable at all. The most concentrated retrogenetic humus would have been powerless against it. I was confronted by a single alternative. Either I would succeed in escaping, or I would live a miserable life as an enumerator on the highways of the netherworld, or at best as a bath attendant. I knew it. The animator didn't know it yet, although he was aware that he wouldn't have an easy time with me. I wasn't having an easy time with myself down here in this timeless duration, this worm-like peristaltic sequentiality where the only clock was the body clock. My doubtful body, which had taken comic calisthenics in its stride, suffered from the incubator heat, from the lack of oxygen in the air, and from the fantastic barometric pressure. Only my primordial energy and my frenetic antipathy against retrovolution saved me from lapsing into the same state as poor old BH. One other thought encouraged me now and then. I was privileged to experience a Tartarophania, a sightseeing tour of the underworld, such as even the authors of the Odyssey and the Aeneid had not described. Their Plutonian visions reflected only the current concepts of their eras. I, however, was visiting a netherworld without model and without parallel, a man-made Tartarus which the cleverest thinkers and the boldest dreamers of my own day could not have foretold. While I had no clear notion in the course of my visit that I would ever be permitted to give an account of my journey, still the mere wish to relate what I had seen served as a powerful incentive to my will to live. It was quite true that mankind had come very close to the fulfillment of its eternal dream of victory over death down here. Despite my violent resistance, I have to admit it. The act of dying had certainly been conquered, and in a manner that was by no means fantastically absurd to the 20th century mind, since it was along strictly naturalistic lines. A return ticket to organic evolution was certainly not in the realm of miracles but in the realm of advanced natural science. Meanwhile, my battle with the animator went on without interruption. I could see that the white-smocked Pluto was simply itching to go to work on a recalcitrant. That would be an agreeable diversion in his profession. But he was so anxious that he miscalculated and made mistakes. He failed to take into account, for example, my tough physique which dated from the 19th century and not from the refined and debilitated astro-mental present. He hoped to wear me down and exhaust me by making me walk long distances. Old hiker that I was, however, I was used to much longer walks, and besides, the conditions down here were far more bearable in motion than at rest. Our hotel room would have been much more dangerous in my present state than the endless daisy fields that we had now reached. Furthermore, the animator hoped to make me drunk or relaxed by constantly plying me with the cognac-like elixir, and the bath attendants kept serving it to me. But for some reason it had the opposite effect. My body probably still carried around some organic memories of gin and rum and whiskey, and under the abnormal conditions in the subterranean cave the elixir merely served to exhilarate it, while genuine astro-mental physiques would likely have succumbed. Although my situation was almost hopeless, I was filled with a confidence that is hard to justify. Perhaps my illogical sense of security stemmed from my secret conviction that not only the bath attendants but all the Stygian functionaries were, as I described them once before, colossi on clay feet and nothing more. No matter how they towered over me, no matter how they stamped along like bull-necked truck drivers and piano movers, my instinct recognized that their muscular strength was not commensurate with their powerful appearance. While I had never been a boxer or a wrestler, I felt that I was a match for them. Life down here in the Earth's cavity had, after all, reduced them to mere shadow creatures. The clouds in the infinitely high ceiling had become darker, and the low fog and drizzle had changed into a definite light rain. The expanse of the daisy fields stretched out as far as my eye reached. The daisies were tall, straight, mostly white but occasionally yellow, flowers as large as the palm of my hand, and there were millions and countless millions of them. They sprang from the male and female blastocysts that had been removed from their amniotic cavities at the proper moment of retrovolution and had been transplanted here. When the spectator reminded himself that the flowers in these endless fields were the dead, generations upon generations of dead humans who had undergone this final and cleanest metamorphosis, it was a moving and solemn scene. And yet the strange desolation and monotony of all astromental phenomena predominated here too. But even I, as a recalcitrant, had to acknowledge that it was more beautiful and more dignified to become a daisy in the daisy fields than to be shoved into a shallow hole under the Earth's surface to rot. But why daisies? I asked the animator. Aren't they a lovely, modest species to house the last worthless remnants of men? He countered. And he added with a giggle, we call them oracle flowers because we ask them whether our sweethearts over on the mound of the wet nurses are true to us. You know, she loves me not. The mound of the wet nurses is always at your disposal. Seigneur. That's not the reason, I said brusquely. You're right, it isn't. Seigneur. We've come down in the world recently. We used to plant and raise genuine sunflowers, big as cartwheels, almost regular individuals. We humans are sun children, that's why we get chilly so frequently. The daisies are the result of a compromise. We can't expect our staff of gardeners and supervisors to do too much walking, and genuine sunflowers take up more than twice as much room. We were walking along a fairly wide lane between the fields. I was supporting BH, who barely dragged himself ahead. The animator turned to face us, and it seemed to me there was a faint note of derision in his words. Wonderful, splendid, I shouted loudly. We won't fall down and stain your daisies red with our blood. You have seen something, Seigneur, that few people have seen since time immemorial, the white smock declared with a slight bow. And we'll be eternally grateful to our animator for it. This mendacious sentence burst from me almost like a cheer. At that instant BH pulled himself together. His chest creaked like a slot machine and his voice imitated mine. Eternally grateful. Eternally grateful. Fine, and now gentlemen, I'm sure you want to go back home and have a little shut-eye, don't you? Not a bit of it, I yodeled energetically. We're just beginning to have a good time. We're Olympic champions when it comes to staying awake, both of us. I began to move ahead at a brisk pace, for in the dim distance I had noticed a high wall, undoubtedly the outer wall, and that was where I wanted to be. What happened now was a surprise even to me. Neither the animator nor bath attendants 1 and 2 could keep up with me, although I had to drag BH along. They panted, grumbled, and finally began to lag behind. My superior stamina filled me with triumphant joy. It proved that I was in a position to wear out the strength of my guardians and pursuers without losing mine. At the spot where a narrow path leading to the wall branched off from the road, I stopped in complete composure to wait for the others. I chuckled to myself in deep satisfaction at the sight of the animator and the 2 colossi staggering and reeling along, pale and breathless. That's not advisable. Seigneur, not advisable at all, the little fellow panted, you with your heart. You forget, cher maître, I laughed, that I'm a wild barbarian who doesn't care a bit if his heart suddenly stops beating. I don't feel sorry for myself at all, and I'm not as afraid of death as your honorable astromental contemporaries. A civilized person shouldn't even soil his mouth with that dirty and indecent word beginning with a D. The heart is to stop beating when it has gotten back to the point where it is 3 times 7 days old. How about a little more heart medicine, Seigneur? Let's have it. And make it a decent drink this time. The animator's eyes popped as he watched me take a boastful drink right out of the jug. Forgive me for using the dirty word once more, dear maître, I said, handing back the jug and striding along briskly again. What would happen to me if I fell down dead? Nothing good would happen to you at all, he moaned. We would have to take you to the catabolites. Well, for heaven's sake, something new again. What on earth are catabolites? Just thank your lucky stars, Seigneur, that you'll never find out what catabolites are. But I have the firm desire, the inflexible intention, to find out just that. Sorry, Seigneur, the Constitution forbids it. In the Jebel they concealed nothing from me, not even the most exalted riddles of the universe and the most important moment of my life, I said. But I had touched a sore spot in the animator's heart. Pretty soft for the fellows in the Jebel, he flew into a rage. A lot of highbrows. They don't even do research, they merely acquire aimless learning. Chronosophy is the smuggest kind of self-complacency. They coast around in cosmic space for the sole purpose of marveling at their own silly marveling and of feeling foreign enough to turn your stomach. And have they really solved any riddles of the universe worth mentioning? The universe is wedded to itself. Even the Bible tells us that Eve was inside Adam in the shape of his rib. We down here in the Earth's womb aren't half so pretentious. We have only the best designs. We serve mankind. We don't do aimless research, but research for practical, useful purposes. We practice applied science. It's our business to be practical, practical, practical. Still I insist on the catabolites, I declared dryly. The prohibition applies to you too, Seigneur. I can't do anything about it. We had passed through one of the daisy fields. The dead had a strange mucilaginous smell, faintly reminiscent of chamomile. Now we turned into the wide road that ran along the outer wall. It was a perfectly smooth, fairly high wall, constructed of a sort of translucent plastic, such as we had known back in my days. I believe that not even Laurent, the star dancer, could have developed the necessary agility to scale this wall. Meanwhile, the animator had switched his tactics in order to keep me from setting too fast a pace and putting a strain on his and his men's endurance. The bath attendants now marched leisurely at the head of our little party, blocking the road with their flabby, chunky behinds. Next in the procession came he himself, our sightseeing guide, sauntering with relaxed knees. BH and I brought up the rear. This new formation, however, proved to be to my advantage. I slowed down and shortened my steps so that the interval between the animator and myself became greater and greater. For to my great joy I had discovered a sort of drainage canal that ran through a grating in the outer wall. I was grateful to my astigmatic eyes for never leaving me in the lurch in a real crisis. In any case, it was essential to mark the spot. What I did was nothing more than a plagiarism on ancient myths and fairy tales. I quickly kneeled down at the edge of the field and tied the end of the red yarn that the girl on the mound of the wet nurses had given me to a big clump of blooming daisies. This was the work of a few seconds. Then I rose, concealed the ball of yarn again, and reeled off the red thread as we strolled slowly along. The animator hadn't noticed a thing. I pretended to be extremely busy with my friend BH, who incidentally was very much in need of help and encouragement. He could scarcely walk and kept begging, "Let me lie down. It's very pleasant here." "I won't let you lie down," I said, punching him in the ribs, "and it's very, very unpleasant here." "Do you really find it unpleasant?" he babbled. "I don't believe you. Just your stubbornness. You find it unpleasant too, BH, very unpleasant." I whispered suggestively. "You want to die decently too, instead of being retrovolved. And that isn't stubbornness at all. If I only had some benzodrine or caffeine with me, I'd fix you up in a hurry. As it is, you'll have to believe me and trust me." By this time, all the rest of them are tiny tots, BH stammered, tears in his eyes, my friends Lo Fager and Lo Raza and the ancestress and the good old bachelors of our household, and I'm the only one who still has to be an adult. "And you'll remain an adult, BH, I give you my word. Come on. Pull yourself together. But I want to be a little baby like the others. It's so wonderful to be a little baby. You don't understand our civilization, FW, you're still too mobile." "Thank God that I'm mobile, BH." "Are you gentlemen having an argument?" said the animator, turning 1/8 of his profile toward us. "One of you wants to rest, I suppose. Golden rest, sweet rest, carefree rest, pleasure of pleasures, rest without idleness. It's too bad we still have to keep moving, step by step, freezing in the rain and cold, until we reach shelter." The animator's teeth chattering, hypocritical sing-song gave him away. He knew we were getting close to our destination, and now he was trying to prolong the distance in order to break the remnants of BH's strength and wear down my resistance. Pleased with my own cunning, I pretended to be utterly exhausted, although I felt stronger and more determined at this moment than ever. "Keep going, Maitre, keep going, right along," I begged, eliding my consonants as though I had 3 sheets in the wind. "We're coming, right with you. Let's take it easy. We've got secrets, my friend and I. Little discretion, if you please." "Discretion to whom discretion is due," the animator smiled, lapsing into his twisted phraseology. "Far be it from me to disturb you or to hurry you." And he turned to move on. Now I grabbed BH by the wrists and shook him with all my might. It worked. He began to waken from his stupor. "Don't you see that I'm battling?" I whispered. "Why don't you help me? Don't make it harder for me, at least." The distance between our guards and us had increased. They had just passed a signboard that marked a narrow little side path leading from the main road back into the fields. At this point, the daisies happened to be particularly tall. The animator seemed to be very sure of us, for he observed strict discretion and never turned around. I talked to BH in a louder and louder tone, and finally I even sang to him, "Tramp, tramp, tramp, the boys are marching." The inscription on the signboard read, "Warning. No one except the animator on duty is permitted to enter this path." I don't know what prompted me to the rash decision to double back on our tracks at this point and to give our sauntering guards the slip. In part it was undoubtedly the hope that we might find a hiding place among the extraordinarily tall flowers which reached up to our chests and sometimes even to our chins. Moreover, since only the animator was permitted to enter this forbidden path, we would get rid of the bath attendants. But more than by these logical reasons, I was lured by the strong temptation to walk on a forbidden path in the Wintergarten and at its end perhaps to gaze on the most forbidden of all forbidden sights. I motioned to BH to keep very still. Then I seized his hand, pulled lustily, and we both began to run. The red thread reeling out from under my coat followed us for a long distance. When only a tiny nub of the ball of yarn was left, I tossed it into the daisies. We couldn't see our pursuers any more than they could see us. But instead of stopping and finding a hiding place among the daisies at the side of the path, we ran on and on like mad. After a while the path sloped downward, and then it seemed to me that I could hear a confused babble of voices like people quarreling. It could have been a moderately spectacular barroom battle at a great distance or the noise of a bazaar in an oriental city. But that was true only of the first instant, for almost immediately distinct human voices became audible. There was something wrong about these human voices, however. Although they undoubtedly issued from hoarse adult male throats, yet they screeched in the highest soprano pitch. They were, how shall I express it? They were dwarf-like voices. Finally we passed a place where the daisies were withered. Although these last remnants of the dead were completely meaningless, it was an unspeakably sad sight. Then we stood, and again I am at a loss to say what we faced as we stood there. It was a kind of a plowed turnip patch that extended far and wide before our eyes, very far and very wide. And out of this plowed field, along with a creeping mist from the furrows, arose this querulous babble of human voices. Most of my former contemporaries, to whom I was fortunately permitted to return from my precarious situation in the Wintergarten, are familiar with the comic caricature film of Donald, the Valiant Duck, and they are familiar with his indignant gabbling in which animal and human sounds are grotesquely mixed. Now imagine this croaking, quacking, screeching, indignant gabbling diminished, reduced in individual volume, but at the same time multiplied into a chorus of 5,000 Donalds, and you will have a vague notion of what we heard long before we saw anything. The soft but sharp, feeble but shrilly screeching eruption of human rage rising from the extensive turnip field made me forget everything else. I no longer thought of my own peril, at least not until I had investigated this phenomenon, and that took a full 2 minutes. To tell the truth, I had to kneel down in order to discover that I was actually standing at the edge of a kind of a turnip field, although the analogy is imperfect. The concept of a turnip field presented itself because the objects that I was looking at were planted like turnips in regularly spaced rows, each in its neatly cultivated mound of retrogenetic humus. Out of these mounds grew long, nondescript foliage, from the center of which the turnips protruded. They were very large turnips that not only grew under the ground in the approved manner but also projected a considerable distance above the ground in the shade of the green leaves. I had to look very closely for a very long time to convince myself that these enraged, gabbling turnips were tiny aged men who were trying wildly to tear themselves loose from the grip of the soil. They were each about 8 to 10 inches in length. They waved their arms madly and twisted their torsos in a St. Vitus *S dance of agonized exertion. The upper parts of their bodies were well developed and strong, the lower part apparently less perfect. The little faces, on the other hand, were fully modeled like those of Tanagra figurines, unspeakably aged and furrowed with wrinkles and creases. One and another of them had green stalks growing out of their bald pates. All of them had sparse, tousled, white chin whiskers. Their tiny eyes glittered with baleful hatred, and their black, horrible, wide-open mouths squawked and gabbled the foulest obscenities that I had ever heard in a single place in a brief time. "What's that? What's that?" BH groaned. "Possibly our future," I replied. "No, no," he screamed. "I want to be a baby, but not that." "Can you prevent it, BH?" "That's the risk you run in retrovolution, and there's no insurance against it. Those are the unsuccessful cases, and we don't need the animator to tell us that. Of course, whether these are the catabolites I can't say. And all this filth and smut. The only way I can explain it, I surmised, is that the smut that has accumulated in 180 years of astromental culture has to come out finally. That's the obverse of the fine manners and elegant behavior. Oh, FW, I don't want to. Why am I so weak? I put my arms around my friend. It was like a brotherly vow to do my utmost to save him. At this moment the angry gabbling of the turnip men merged into a single cry evoked by our presence. Out of this chorus, however, I distinguished one word more and more clearly from just under my feet. This word was seigneur. I quickly stooped down to one of the plants, and the creature I drew out of the ground was none other than the spokesman of the Lofager household, the Voltaire-like master of astromental causerie, who had had the bad luck to become a turnip man after a few hours of retrovolution instead of an embryo. I held the turnip man by his waist, sick with disgust. It was anything but a turnip. It was naked, feverish human flesh, SMAU as it was. The big black hole that was a mouth slobbered. Spittle and tears ran down into the tousled beard and dripped on my hand. I recall the following words screamed out of the hoarse throat. Yes, it's I, Seigneur. Take a look at me, take a smell of me. I've been cheated all my life. And the idea of the winter garden was always the subject of my most beautiful causeries. I want to shout words at you that I never even knew as a philologist: nightshit, pus boil, bloody mucus. You're no Seigneur, you're a god-stinking edema, a cancer, a tumor. Put me back. Give him to me, said the animator who had arrived unnoticed, took the turnip man out of my hand and planted him back in his place, where the spokesman joined in the terrible gabbling chorus of the 1,000 other unsuccessful cases. After the custodian had carefully rebuilt the mound of soil around the shrunken causer, he rose and looked at me. You didn't harm me, he said, but only yourself. In what way did I harm myself? I asked defiantly. The more you entangle yourself, the greater your risk. Whoever looks upon the forbidden becomes forbidden himself. I dry my hands in innocence. Are those the catabolites, animator? No, but since you've gone this far in your irresponsibility, you'll get to see the catabolites too. Why do you let these travesties on the image of God suffer so pitifully? I screamed, stamping my foot. Because a few among them still have a chance, he lisped sharply. We'll soon see. Then they'll get their slumber bath. How is it possible, I raged, how can the Constitution permit anyone to enter upon the famous voluntary road without informing the volunteers of the horrible possibilities that confront them? The world is wrapped in darkness. And you intensify the darkness. Now I understand Joel's hatred. The risks have nothing to do with the Constitution, the animator replied. They lie in the individual. We're not at fault. The individual is at fault. How can you blame the poor individuals? I yelled beside myself. All they've done is walk into your trap. Didn't you read the inscription in your room, Seigneur, the words of a great sage, what you are is the reward and punishment for what you are? I protest. Unsuccessful retrovolution can only be attributed to the carelessness of the functionaries. Otherwise, why should one individual turn into an honest daisy and another into a devilish turnip? After all, most individuals are only types. Knew I was being dishonest when I spoke the final sentence and, of course, I gave the animator an opportunity to parade his moral indignation as he had done repeatedly before. You're no pious man. Seigneur, you're a nihilist. I, however, serve the immortal soul in my work that knows neither day nor night. Individuals are not types. Individuals are unique and unrepeatable creatures. They are unipersonal, sir. The winter garden furnishes irrefutable proof of this fact, for among the tens of thousands of cases that I retrovolved there was not a single repetition. And even these unfortunates here have a chance to eject the evil from their consciousness before they enter the realm of silence. I was so profoundly moved by the animator's words that I closed my eyes and bowed my head in deep spiritual grief. He had called me a nihilist. All my life, as far back as I could think, I had waged war against the nihilism that I carried within me as a child of the 19th century. Hadn't I conquered it long ago? Or was my soul still full of error? The devil himself had to appear to prove to me that I was a heretic. My faith in the indestructibility of being was not perfect. I had confounded type and individual. I would certainly share the spokesman's fate and become a turnip man. Oh God, help me and keep me from blaspheming anymore. I clung tightly to the hand of my poor friend while the querulous gabbling died away in the distance and we felt the moving sidewalk under our feet again, a rumbling, jolting sidewalk this time that was undoubtedly intended only for the hired help. My heart and my hand get heavier and heavier as I turn to the description of the things we saw in the endless drainage canal along whose high embankment we were now rolling. I curse my fate that transplanted me into the 11th cosmic capital year of Virgo that permitted me to cast a glance into the minor intermundium. That led me into the winter garden where men deluded themselves in the belief that they had conquered the misery of dying and that still did not permit me to bring home a lovely wreath wound of pure beauty and radiant hope. Isn't mankind of my century, the 20th, in greater need of beauty and hope than of the sad truth that all things earthly end in catastrophe and must be rebuilt again and again? They probably picked the wrong reporter when they sent me. No matter how much this thought torments me, there's nothing to be done about it. I am I and no one else, and I have to report what my eyes saw, my ears heard, and my spirit grasped. I shall not claim that the sight of the catabolites was worse or even half as bad as the sights that many of my contemporaries attested in the horror camps of Buchenwald or Maidanek. This comparison, utterly wrong, of course, refers only to external similarities, for the catabolites were by no means victims of torture and murder but, like the turnip men, Merely cases of unsuccessful retroevolution that had fallen by the wayside. I can't even say what the percentage of miscarried cases was and whether it was great enough to constitute a valid objection to the idea of the Wintergarten. It certainly had no bearing on the subjective side of the idea, the transformation of the process of dying into a joyous experience. The risks lie in the individual. The meaning of these words of the animator was suddenly horribly clear to me. The smooth progress of retroevolution was not dependent upon external circumstances, not upon the retrogenetic humus nor the meticulous care of the bath attendants, but upon the candidate himself who lay down voluntarily in the cradle grave. Astromental mankind had not only supplanted sudden and uncontrolled death by a controlled process, it had also abolished the diseases that formerly led to death. The fatal illnesses, however, that all of us people of the 20th century knew, that is, know, and experience in our own bodies are in many instances not undeserved, particularly in individuals who attain a ripe old age. They are the cumulative result of all our sensual sins against our own nature. This body of ours bears the injuries we inflict on it more or less patiently until one day it breaks down. Of course, the relation of cause and effect, of sin and disease, was no longer as obvious as it had been in the beginnings of mankind. Astromental people did not gluttonize, they were no drunkards, they used no drugs, their sexual life had been sublimated, and yet even in their world the unvarying measure of evil had not disappeared. Their lewdness was only more hidden, their perversions only more concealed. They poisoned their minds with more exquisitively lascivious fantasies and their bodies with more heinous stimulants. They did not fall ill as a result of self-abuse, or rather, they did not wait to fall ill. The effects, however, became apparent in the Wintergarten. They manifested themselves in stoppages in the retrogenetic process. They manifested themselves in the raving, gabbling turnip men in the plowed field. They manifested themselves in the catabolites in the drainage canal. Sinful man had to pay with his body even here where the cleanliest and most complete dissolution of the physical being had been devised. If the catabolites had only been refused, only the corpses of the unfortunates who had suffocated in the early stages of retrogenesis or had succumbed to cerebral or cardiac hemorrhages, I would simply have covered my nose with my handkerchief, which I did anyhow, and turned my back. But the animator forced me now to gaze on this most forbidden and forbidding spectacle. And so I too am now forced to let the reader gaze on this most forbidden and forbidding spectacle. The canal along whose levee we moved was neither very deep nor very wide. It resembled one of the small, perfectly straight canals that traverse the length and breadth of the lower sections of Holland. It differed from such canals in the fact that it was not filled with sluggish but none the less flowing water. At the same time, it could not be said that the ditch was completely dry. Its marshy bottom was full of pools and puddles which were not produced solely by the eternal drizzle from the lofty cloud ceiling. The animator didn't need to tell me that the canal was flooded from time to time by opening the locks of certain reservoirs in order to flush away the catabolites. In the murky gloom we could even see the place where the ditch ended and where the canal water deposited its repulsive cargo. It was a large lake extending to the horizon, if the word horizon can be appropriately applied here. Incidentally, the leaden, Stygian character of this lake was not entirely new to me. In my old home on the borders of Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria there were several extensive, shallow lakes that looked a great deal like this one in the bowels of the earth. Only the sinister impression of these lakes in the steppes of Eastern Europe was alleviated by a wealth of birds and amphibians. Flamingos and silver herons and Egyptian ibis nested in the reeds, the bitterns boomed and bellowed all day long, and malachite giant frogs took up the chorus at night under the full moon. Here, on the other hand, unbroken silence reigned in the misty, steaming drizzle, although it would be incorrect to speak of complete lifelessness. The most gruesome things down there in that ditch were not the few adult bodies that had not survived even the first stages of retroevolution, nor the more numerous remains of adolescence, nor even the many corpses of children and infants with distorted, aged faces. It was not abnormal for a mysterious and tremendous process like that of retroevolution to be interrupted by the sudden death of the unfit. The animator, who had become extremely laconic, for we couldn't pull any more wool over each other's eyes, then uttered a truth. The bolder a human institution, the grimmer the resistance it meets. The perils to which certain individuals were exposed in the retrogenetic humus were plain to our sight. Among the ordinary people down there who had died an ordinary death during retrogenesis, living creatures were wriggling and squirming. I saw little reddish human pigs with rooting snouts and hands and feet grown together into cloven hoofs, wallowing listlessly and almost lifelessly in the puddles. In the same puddles I saw human fish, cylindrical trunks, 15 to 18 inches long, with glistening scales and limbs that were almost fins, while their infant heads stared into the gloom with mother-of-pearl goggle eyes and gasped for air with round salmon mouths. I saw human toads, and this species appeared to lie the most numerous humanized salamanders, or rather, salamanderized homunculi, long-tailed creatures with the heads of human embryos that slithered over the corpses, tried to siege the walls of the ditch, but always fell back again in mortal weakness. In order to understand these horrid phenomena, I limit myself to 3 of them. I didn't even require the animator's explanations. Just as all of nature carries man within it, so man carries all of nature within him. I had learned that in the important moment when I looked through the gate of the Viscarad home for incurables and saw the goat man with horn-like excrescences on his forehead, on all fours with raised hind end. The 26 trillion cells that constitute our body are the building blocks for all existing possibilities. They obey the laws of form that are in control at the crucial moment. I squeezed BH's hand as I spoke but avoided looking at the animator. It's perfectly clear to me, I began, that in the course of retrogenesis one individual or another fails to pass the pig stage or the fish stage and gets stuck there. I also understand that at the same instant the process of cell division gets on the wrong track and instead of shrinkage new growth in the wrong direction sets in. But I don't understand that the management of the Wintergarten is not in a position to diagnose such cases in time and to prevent such accidents. We look at the hearts but not into the hearts, the animator said briefly. He insisted on his claim. Retrogenesis was not to blame, nor the lofty idea of the Wintergarten by which man had learned to control death. The blame for all these abnormalities rested on the egos that contained them. Among hundreds of thousands of candidates, so many could never turn into lovely, peaceful daisies. Ordinary people, average people, were the best bets to become daisies. But everyone who carried an excess of anything within him, whether of vegetative impulses or spiritual disharmonies, ran the risk of turning into a catabolite before his heart ceased beating. And the human piglets and human fish were not by far the worst possibilities. Personally, I was most terribly shocked by the things that I should like to call the independent limbs. Here, for example, I saw a tiny, breathing body that belonged to what we would call a premature, 7-month baby, one of whose arms had not retrovolved. An arm grew out of one of the shoulder joints, grew in ghastly crescendo, first small and thin, getting larger and larger, stronger and stronger, until it culminated in a powerful man's forearm and a big, heavy, hairy hand. This hand opened and opened again, groped about, sought a hold, dragging along the little body to which it was attached, rested, groped some more, moving slowly from place to place. I had to think of the fairy tale of the man who had struck his mother and whose hand grew out of the grave. What was true of the hand was also true of other extremities of the human body. The whimsical poem about the knee that wandered lonely through the world had become reality here, further evidence that the most abstruse notions of the poet's brain are always somehow based on actuality. The most repulsive things of all, however, that I could scarcely bear to look at and that I hesitate to divulge, were hypertrophic male genitals that moved in feeble erections while the infant bodies to which they belonged seemed to be already dead. Where, I exclaimed indignantly, does the Wintergarten get the right to inflict dantesque, hellish punishments on people who have trustingly submitted to its ministrations? That's a layman's question, the animator behind us retorted, and he no longer lisped nor indulged in any of his earlier mannerisms but continued in a lower tone. And for that reason laymen are not permitted to see the catabolites because they neither understand nor evaluate correctly what they see. They only hurt themselves. There are no hellish punishments in the Wintergarten. Quite the contrary. By virtue of the debased or one-sided forms which the retrovolved body is forced to assume when psychic defects of the personality hinder the smooth, normal process, the soul is free to these defects while it is still alive. It is better for the soul to have this disease inflict itself on the body than to take it along into the beyond. We'll not speak of the beyond, I interrupted him brusquely. The horrid things I am looking at are suffering here. Again the layman's wrong thinking. Who's suffering? The salamanders aren't suffering, nor are the pigs and salmons and toads. The hypertrophic limbs don't suffer either, for they have no consciousness whatever, only a certain kinesthetic instinct. Not even the turnip men, some of whom can still be saved, are really suffering. They are definitely exhibitionists and their coprolalia gives them pleasure. Besides, it's all over very soon. The water washes down the canal and carries the catabolites into the Nemodrome. Nemodrome? Is this lake here called Nemodrome? It is, although it *s really a lake of oblivion. A sort of Lethe? Did you hear that, BH? We call it Nemodrome, Asterisk, very few visitors have a chance to see it. Usually only real sufferers. Real sufferers? As for example you. Senior and I. Does the nemodrome consist of an acid in which organic bodies are dissolved? Far from it. The nemodrome consists of light water. Something new again. What on earth is light water? It's the famous water that isn't wet. Haven't you ever heard the chemical term heavy water? Wait a moment. It seems to me I picked up a popular magazine in a dentist's waiting room once upon a time and read an article about heavy water. But it might have been about liquid air. Well, light water is the exact opposite of that. Is it perhaps baptismal water of astromental men that causes them to forget? That's nothing new. I keep stumbling on mythological realities. That's wrong. Light water doesn't destroy anything. It is an extractive element. It extracts the swarms of images, the hordes of ghosts from our consciousness. It makes us empty and pure and ready. What does that mean? Empty and pure and ready? I fervently distrust such words. For a moment the animator relapsed into his lyric tone. Oh, Senior, light water gives you the climax of all joys. The embankment on which we were rolling had left the side of the catabolite canal. It had become narrower and the moving sidewalk had become even bumpier and seemed in a bad state of repair. At our right and left grew giant thistles and tall brush covered with alkali dust, reminding me of the shores of the Dead Sea or of the Great Salt Lake. I noticed a number of shovels sticking in the sand, evidence that excavating was necessary here at times. We were all three silent. The animator had left the bath attendants behind somewhere before rejoining us at the field of the turnip men. BH's head was hanging low. Perhaps he couldn't speak anymore. I held him tightly. Incalculable danger lay ahead of us. My crystal-clear consciousness of it lent unexpected strength not only to my mind but also to my overwrought body. I considered, should I jump from the running sidewalk and drag my friend with me? It wouldn't have been of any use. After a short sprint the animator would have recaptured us. Meanwhile the embankment had given way to a rickety wooden pier. This pier extended far out into the lake. The sidewalk stopped moving. I could see the water between the rotten planks of the pier. Mist was rising from it. BH and I walked on slowly. The pier had no railing. I had made my plan. 10 more slow, well-counted steps, then I would turn suddenly, hurl my full weight on the little man behind me and shove him into the waters of the nemodrome. Very embarrassing. The last time I hurled my full weight on anybody was when I was 17 or 18 years old. Well, it couldn't be helped. 1, 2, 3, 4. Just as I took the 5th step the bridge suddenly collapsed and BH and I slid gently down a board incline into the water. We didn't fall. There we stood in the fog and water up to our chests. It was really light water. It felt like a lukewarm liquid, but it moistened neither our clothing nor our bodies. When I pulled my hand out of the water the drops ran down like pellets of mercury without leaving a trace of moisture. The animator was standing about 15 paces fr 6m us at the edge of the pier where a section had neatly collapsed on well-placed hinges. If his white smock had not gleamed so brightly he would have been invisible in the mist and gloom. His high-pitched, rhythmic, professorial voice, however, rang clearly through the murky haze. Believe me, Honorable iOS, this was merely done for your own good. I advise you by all means to relax. No blessing from heaven could make you happier than this immersion. The light water will rid you of your cramped reluctance and convulsive resistance. I'll be back directly to receive your thanks, I hope. Otherwise, or would you like to lead a life such as I have been leading for longer than I can remember, a life without day and night? We had been fairly lucky after all in our treacherous slide into the lake, for we stood close together in the light water. That made it possible for me to put my arm about my friend again and again. Every time I did it I felt him breathing more deeply as though life and consciousness were returning to him. It was pitiful to hear him babbling fragmentary sentences, assuring me that he was trying to pull himself together and that he wouldn't give up as the animator wanted him to do. I really can't say from what source I drew my own confidence and courage. Knowing my own character, I should say they stemmed from my thoroughly unwarranted and incorrigible optimism. It's an almost pathological optimism because it is rooted in the childish, overweening faith that among all humans I am expressly, exclusively, and solely the one to whom nothing ultimately bad could ever happen. We could move the upper parts of our bodies freely while our legs had gradually settled in the soft, muddy bottom. In order not to waste my strength, I gave up the efforts to pull my feet out of it after a few futile attempts. In heavy water, I thought, the body becomes light. In the Dead Sea near Jericho and in the Great Salt Lake a swimmer can't sink. In light water bodies must be heavy. There's no sense in speculating. That too is a useless waste of effort. In order to keep BH awake, I began a conversation. I guessed all the time that the animator was a recalcitrant. All the officials are recalcitrants. Yet he held out more than 100 years in spite of the fact that he has an astromental body that isn't immune to the black humus. But my body isn't astromental and therefore it's immune. As long as you are with me and I hold on to you, BH, nothing can happen to you. Very well, Colonel, as you say, sir, he babbled in a dead, drunken tone. We only have to work our way up to the bridge. That's all. After these words of mine it began. What began? There were people all about us. People were crowding around us in the fog and I couldn't see clearly where they were standing. They were standing on the water. At times they had the flickering character of reflections on the water. But they weren't a bit like phantoms or shadows. They were so plain and so real that I assumed they were standing on a raft or a big flat barge that had brought them near us. But that wasn't possible either, for they were all around us, seeking to attract our attention by waving their hats and by calling to us. I'm sure BH had recognized acquaintances among them. His eyes were gleaming. As for me, the first acquaintance I discovered was an old gentleman, the philosopher. Professor H.M., a genial old soul who had often talked and joked with me when I was a little boy. There he was, big as life, in his ill-fitting sack suit, his long gray hair brushed straight back, with steel-rimmed glasses and a little goatee. The birds that he used to feed were fluttering around him. It was obvious that the entire crowd about us was made up of acquaintances, and not only of acquaintances but also of people who had been very close to me in my most distant past. The sensitive reader will understand, however, and will forgive me for not speaking of the people who had been very close to me, but only of a few casual acquaintances whom I happened to notice. The light water of the Nemodrome had extracted this host of perfectly distinct and genuine people from within me, and the animator had been entirely in error when he spoke of a horde of ghosts. BH undoubtedly was seeing quite different people and presumably 10 times as many as I. The strange thing was a certain reversal of the sequence of time. You could have called it a time negative in the same sense as a photographic negative. The people in the crowd who were standing nearest me and who were most sharply defined down to the buttons of their old-fashioned garments were those who belonged to my childhood and early youth, while those in the more distant and more indistinct ranks were the people who had shared or crossed the path of my life in later years. In the very foreground I even saw a number of men and women of various stations in life who were familiar but whose names I could not recall. I was so accustomed, however, to the sight of even these nameless ones that it seemed to me as though I had never been separated from them for a second in all my life, including my absence in purgatory. In a general way, this throng could best be compared to an impressive crowd jamming the platform of a railroad station to bid farewell to a prominent fellow citizen who is leaving the country. In a manner of speaking, I myself was the prominent fellow citizen leaning from the Pullman platform. It took a long time before I became aware of the situation, for I was much too busy recognizing and recalling people. The others, however, seemed to know very well what it was all about. They waved at me vigorously. There was a half-witted old beggar, of whom I had been very much afraid when I was a child, moving about in a hostile, hateful sort of St. Vitus's dance. Next to him stood a tall, slender gentleman in an elegant fur coat, waving his slouch hat in graceful, rhythmic motions. Why, that was Drive S, for goodness sake, our great local poet, the first real poet I had ever known. Our great local poet really and truly looked like a poet, including the long hair, just as a poet was supposed to look at the turn of the century, neo-romantic and with a restrained tendency toward decadence. The remarkable thing was that our local poet, with his hollow cheeks, his confused eyes, and his drooping mustache, was fully aware of the prototype to which he corresponded. Whenever he was invited to recite his poems before a literary club in one of the neighboring small towns, he inevitably wrote a stereotyped note to the lady in charge of the affair. Dear Mrs. So-and-so, I am arriving in your charming city on the morning train. I expect to be met at the station by one of the ladies of your club. I may be recognized by the fact that I really look like a poet. For me, however, the boy of yesteryear, he not only looked like a poet, he was one. When I was 12 or 13 years old, I cringed in reverent awe whenever I met our local bard and seer in the streets. At the same tender age, I was once privileged to be present in a compartment of a railroad train where several adults were asking him questions about the wonders of poetry and what sort of a thing a poem really was, and how a good poem could be distinguished from a poor one with perfect precision. The ripe summer landscape of my native land rolled leisurely past the sooty window, distant hills, villages, fields of maturing grain, in endless monotony. In the midst of the yellow grain, the July sun presently fell on a forlorn little cemetery so that its gray markers and crosses glistened. Our local poet pointed the well-manicured nail of his index finger at this scene and said, "You see, ladies and gentlemen, that is a poem," and now he was greeting me in the fog of the Nemodrome, looking at me earnestly and waving his slouch hat at rhythmic intervals. Not far from him I recognized the physician. I call him the physician of my childhood, although he wasn't at all. He only put his bearded head on my chest in the old-fashioned manner on 2 or 3 occasions when I tried to make believe I was sick so that I wouldn't need to go to school. He did, however, take us boys on long Sunday hikes through forests and fields, half naked as Pan, and in his hoarse, cheerful voice taught us to classify plants and to distinguish geological formations. Father Exorcist would certainly have ranked the physician of my childhood among the sandal-wearing nature enthusiasts. He would have been wrong in condemning him, however, although the physician of my childhood was a self-professed atheist. Only God, in whom he didn't believe, knows the love and charity in this man's heart and the cheeriness that springs from love alone. One evening I met him on the street. He was carrying a knapsack over his shoulder and a stout stick in his hand. "On a hike?" I asked. "Yes, a long one this time," he laughed and shook hands with me as he always did. I didn't know that he was on his way to the hospital voluntarily and on foot to submit to a hopeless operation from which he never returned. And now he was standing there in the fog, natural as ever, waving cheerily at me. These figures I merely drew from the periphery as they caught my eye. But there were hundreds of others waiting, perhaps thousands, waiting for me to take leave of them, and every one of them was so much mine that I could have written many stories about them, filling volume upon volume. They were my people, mine, and they were to be treacherously taken from me by the light water. They were my people, and I was their king, and in a sudden, blinding flash of conviction I knew that they were to live in my soul as long as this soul lived, and that something odious and heinous was about to take place here. But not only figures and faces surrounded me. Scraps of conversation fluttered by like those in a poorly synchronized sound film, noises, and even smells. Incidentally, they were the most banal shreds of gossip imaginable. They contained references to names and things that were all but forgotten. Women's voices named prices of commodities in currencies that went out of existence before 1900. Men's voices waxed indignant about political events and personalities that I couldn't even recall, although the light water of the Nemodrome had extracted these scenes and facts from nowhere but my own inner world. I pricked up my ears when I heard the name of King Edward or of Sarah Bernhardt, or when the querulous voice of an old man deplored the growing brutality of the times, since almost 1,000 persons had paid high admission prices last Sunday to witness the disgusting spectacle of a football game. Tired cab horses clop-clopped over nocturnal pavements, and hansom wheels rattled over cobblestones. Trams jangled and locomotives whistled, funeral corteges and military bands approached and receded with muffled drums. And there was the smell of heavy coal smoke and of freshly roasted coffee and of rain-spattered dust on unpaved streets and of horse apples and chestnut blossoms, and now it smelled of caramels and chocolate. I was able to localize the smell at once. It belonged to a candy store in front of whose door I had often stood and inhaled the delicious odor. And as though she had stepped out of the door of this odor, I saw the young lady in the long, light spring dress and the wide-brimmed Florentine straw hat. She detached herself from the ranks of people waiting for their final dismissal. She seemed to believe she had a right to do that because I had been sweet on her in high school. She waved her tennis racket back and forth, and it was frightening how little she had changed. It didn't seem to make a particle of difference to her that she had died of a horrible disease before she was 20 years old, and she called to me with capricious impatience, "What are we waiting for? Can't you see I'll be late?" Just as the young lady uttered these words, a great spiritual illumination flashed through me, and I would give a good deal if I could keep it from fading and dissolving under my pen, as so many thoughts do that dwell on the brink of the ineffable. How happy I would be if my reader, who never stood up to his chest in the light water of the Nemodrome, could fully grasp the danger to which I was exposed. One thing above all, the retrogenetic humus retrovolved life back to the first last heartbeat, but it did not imperil the personality of the candidate. Or to be more accurate, its effect upon the personality was very much like that of old-fashioned death. The light water of the lake, however, I could distinctly feel it sucking and pulling, threatened the completeness of my ego by seeking to separate the content of my life from me. What was I? What are we? I'll try to express it by means of a simile. I was like a photograph. What is a photograph? It is a sensitive surface and a picture imprinted on that surface. The water of the Nemodrome sought to detach the picture and to leave only the useless, worn-out, empty surface so that the animator would have an easy time me a little later. The faces and figures that surrounded me here in the fog, the near ones and the distant ones, the likes and the dislikes, the attractions and the aversions, the warmths, the tendernesses, the loves. All these I had elaborated in the course of a lifetime into a unified picture. Although this picture was made up of tens of thousands of lines and splotches of color, most of which appeared quite accidental and quite unimportant, yet they formed an indivisible and irreducible entity. Like all other souls, I had succeeded in transforming the eternally fugitive into the fugitively eternal. Only man has mastered that art. The present has no dimension, and for that reason life becomes life only when it no longer exists. Now I knew with a certainty transcending all religious faith that the colorful life about me, of which I was expected to take leave, was my inalienable dowry, and more than that, it was my most personal life's work which I had to offer to God, the true sacrificial incense that rose to his throne. Forgetting was the epitome of all deadly sins. And because I recognized it in more dazzling clarity and in more mortal pain than word-bound thoughts can ever tell, I screamed at my people all about me, "Stay here. Don't move. I won't give you up. I won't give myself up." And BH, who shared my experience, also screamed, "I won't give you up." As he screamed, he clung tightly to me. At that moment, I felt a sharp prick in the pit of my stomach. Something pointed had penetrated the skin. I reached under my vest and pulled out the knitted monstrosity of poisonous green that the wet nurse on the hill had given me. It still had a knitting needle in it. I unrolled it. It was a strong, narrow strip, useless for any purpose as far as I could tell, except as a rope. One end was weighted with a stone and had a rusty hook attached to it. Maybe the wet nurses weren't as moronic and stupid as they looked. At any rate, they saved us. I began to toss the weighted end of the rope at the projecting beams at the end of the pier. It took a lot of time and a lot of effort, but finally it caught. BH put his arms around my neck. I don't know how I succeeded in pulling the double load out of the water. We dropped panting on the bridge. "Don't fall asleep." I warned my friend, "Don't fall asleep." The 24th chapter. Wherein, after further adventures, we bump into the ancestress, surprisingly intact, and finally escape from the uterus matris terrae in the cowls of the brothers of the childlike life. During my entire life in the 20th century, I knocked anybody down. When I was a boy, I had been mixed up in rough and tumble scraps now and then, in the course of which my opponent and I used to roll around on the ground rather aimlessly. In my military career, I had fortunately been an artilleryman, and my actual service with guns had been brief. I had to set the sights according to the computations of the battery commander, and our shells flew out into empty space, for we never saw the hostile target. Knocking down a man was something that I read about in the papers, in reports of holdups or of bibulous parties at which the uninhibited and well-paid demigods of the so-called entertainment industry used to relax from their artistic efforts. The only place I ever saw men knocking each other down was on the screen in B pictures. But I always had the feeling that such rhythmically alternating battles royal didn't even occur in the most criminal circles, and that realism, as is often the case, is accepted as real only because it lacks imagination. And so it was reserved for the Wintergarten of the astromental world to be the first place where I, a fairly gentle person with a somewhat weak stomach, ever hit anybody on the head. And with a shovel at that. Let me hasten to confess that I didn't strike violently or in anger. The purpose was merely to stun the animator in order to rob him of his white smock, and our plan succeeded. I hit him quite cautiously, for I was fully aware of the debility of the retrogenetic functionaries, and I didn't want to commit murder. And yet it was a strange and repulsive feeling when the scoop end of the shovel landed on the animator's deformed skull, an entirely new experience for me. My friend and I had hidden behind the alkali white shrubs to ambush him on his return. Very fortunately, BH had succeeded in shaking off the deadly lethargy that overcame astromental people in the realm of the Wintergarten. The sight of the turnip mannequins and of the catabolites, and finally the battle for the people of his own recollections, had sobered him so thoroughly that he did not relapse into the terrible drunkenness of death as before. He ran about vigorously and exercised his arms and legs in order to increase his alertness and to recover the full use of his powers. Although he didn't speak a word, it was a great satisfaction to realize that he was now at least as passionately anxious as I to escape the blessings of the Wintergarten. When we peered from our hiding place and saw that the animator was not returning alone to inspect our condition, but in company of bath attendant number 2, BH also picked up one of the shovels that lay stacked up at this spot. Although we hadn't agreed on a concerted plan of action, he swatted the bath attendant just as the animator collapsed under my gentle tap. I put number 2's confectioner's cap on my head at once. It was quite a job to get the white smocks off the two Anoop bodies, and BH and I both perspired freely. We had to pull the smocks over their heads. Luckily, the bath attendant had brought along the jug of elixir, and it gave me new, fiery strength. Neither the animator nor his subordinate was wearing underclothes. They were naked as Adam on the first morning. It was a gray, spongy nakedness. When you prodded the flesh of these bodies with your finger, it left a dent. We dragged them up on the pier and slid them down into the lake over the hinged planks. The light water splashed greedily. They regained consciousness simultaneously and struggled to their feet. I was beginning to fear that they would simply wade ashore, since the Lake of Oblivion could have no power over them, for what could they possibly forget? Unexpectedly, however, the waters of the Nemodrome had far more power over the officials of the Wintergarten than over us. They weren't immune at all. I observed that the animator could barely move his torso. Of course, it was perfectly absurd on my part, but I felt constrained to speak a few words of apology. After all, it was the first time I had ever hit a man on the head with a hard object and dumped him unceremoniously into the water, light water or otherwise. "I'm very sorry, Maitre Animator," I shouted out into the fog. "You're a great scientist, you belong to the highest intelligentsia, and it's therefore doubly embarrassing for me to have used physical violence on you." The animator's reply came out of the fog. He was lisping again, but with an effort. I should have remembered that I wasn't dealing with a civilized person. "You should indeed, sir. From your point of view, I'm certainly no civilized person but a troglodyte. And as a troglodyte, I'm too low for the Wintergarten. The worst part of it is," came the voice from the fog, "that you're dragging your well-born friend back into the misery of the past." Yes, thank God I succeeded in doing that, although it took a great effort. You see, that's why we need the white smocks to get out of your institution unnoticed, if Providence is kind. "I'm so cold, I'm freezing," you could hear his teeth chatter in the Nemodrome, and bath attendant number 2 also began to moan softly. "Sorry we can't do anything for you, Maitre. But you're one of the head men of the institute, you'll know what to do. If worst comes to worst, you'll find a nice heap of juicy black humus and lie down in it at last, after 100 years of recalcitrance. And you, Senior, the high-pitched, professorial voice rang cuttingly, you merely squirmed out of the humus out of cowardice, old-fashioned cowardice, because you're afraid of the end. You're a coward and a skunk, and you'd rather stink your existence away in a hole in the ground than choose the end manfully and be master of your fate to the final heartbeat. True, animator, true, every word of it. I love to live, even when my life is as dubious as now. I've no intention of choosing my death voluntarily and of mastering it, even if this mastery is an incredible advance, as many believe. It's very nice to end up as a daisy, white and clean. But the road is too risky when I think of the catabolites. Death stands behind me. I'm not afraid of him, for I've already met him. But I don't want him to stand before me. Cowardice and not enough moral sense of cleanliness, that's all it is. And what about your 100 years of recalcitrance, cher maître? Isn't that cowardice? I asked without derision. My recalcitrance, he shouted back, is a sacrifice that you can't even understand. I've taken this existence upon myself because I haven't finished thinking my thoughts. Shall I tell you my thoughts? I'm afraid I haven't time for that. I give you and your friend up as lost, Seigneur. I'm willing to take you back to the stations. And what are the conditions, Maitre Animator? The only condition is that you help me out of the Nemodrome. Seigneur, just as you helped yourself out. After all, if I'm to take you back, I'll have to go along. I'm surprised, Animator, that astromental men with their unfortunate gift of clairvoyance haven't developed their powers of dissimulation any better. An overtone in your proposal convinces me that you want to put something over on us. The distrust with which you listen to the overtones of my voice is nothing but childish conceit. The Wintergarten doesn't need you. In that case, why are you taking so much trouble with me, cher maître? Every exceptional case arouses the favor of the scientist. I'm afraid I'll have to leave you in the soup. You see, I fear that the favor of the scientist would reawaken at once. I'll take you safely to the main station, you and your friend. I swear it by Saint Retrogenesis. Now help us out of here. The thing about you that frightens me, Maître, is the most dangerous combination in the world, fanaticism and intellectual obstinacy. I've known people like you for 100,000 years and more, from Torquemada down to the racial physicians of the Gestapo with their murderous injections. Besides, I can't help you without getting down into the light water myself. Toss me the umbilical cord, Seigneur. What umbilical cord are you talking about? The green umbilical cord the wet nurses gave you, the goddamned cell dividers and knitters. I hadn't noticed until this moment that I had wrapped the unfortunate girl's knitted strip. How do I know whether she is subjectively unfortunate? Around my waist like a belt. I turned to my friend with genuine enthusiasm. Did you hear that, BH? He calls the wet nurses knitting an umbilical cord. Isn't that marvelous? The eternally feminine draws us up and out. Well, Seigneur, the animator cried in a strangely pinched voice, let's get started. What are we waiting for? I'm surprised, Maître, to find that you're more nervous than I. What can the light water do to you? You haven't any memories except shrinking embryos. Light water can't do anything to us, the words came back softly, shivering, hardly more than squeaking. The next moment proved that it was too late. A rushing and roaring came nearer and nearer. Someone had undoubtedly opened the floodgates, water had filled the drainage canals and was flushing the catabolites into the nemodrome. The surface of the lake began to seethe in the fog and its level rose perceptibly. The animator and his helper were slowly swept away from the shore. We heard no further sound from them. Whether the water that wasn't wet closed over them, I really can't say. In the interval that elapsed between the disappearance of the animator far out in the fog of the nemodrome and our meeting with the ancestress, a good many things happened and most of them were very strenuous. How long that interval was is a question that I can't answer, for, as we know, there was no such thing in the Earth's cavity as a division of time, but only a crawling, worm-like sequence of moments, enveloping events, conversations, and emotions. We lost our sense of time down here, not quite, but almost, as we lost our sense of space in the gray neuter. Only the exhaustion of our bodies gave us an occasional inkling of the length of time that we had been battling. But this was an unreliable clock, for our fatigue came in waves and alternated with periods of the most remarkable energy. It wasn't until we had reached the gray sod up above and had the stars of the third night over our heads that we discovered that our sojourn in the hollow realm of the Wintergarten had lasted about 10 hours. My feeling, however, told me that it was much longer. At this point, I noticed that the novelist in me would willingly yield to the dry travel reporter. That's particularly inappropriate at a moment when we are dealing with flight and pursuit, a situation that has always been a perfect paradise for every epicist. But I have decided to shorten the narrative at this very point and to skip lightly over the events that followed. Why this resignation? Someone asks. Why waste the opportunity to make things a little easier for the reader? Why? Because I'm ashamed of myself. I have treated my reader with the utmost respect. I have presupposed that he was filled with intellectual passion, with tremendous curiosity for facts, experiences, and emotions lying outside the sphere of the 20th century. I shrink, therefore, both morally and stylistically, from making use of the material suspense that presents itself here and to expatiate on the subsequent occurrences to the detriment of the intellectual investigation. No one will doubt that we lost our way repeatedly and that we jumped on rolling sidewalks that carried us in wrong directions. The fact that we had to pass through several turnip fields was a fearful strain on our nerves. In one of these fields, the turnip mannequins had the physical strength to tear themselves loose from their roots and to fasten their teeth in our legs in vampiric fury. It wasn't easy at all to shake off these tick-like outcomes of retrogenesis. I fear I strangled 2 or 3 of them. We had a number of very narrow escapes. In one instance, for example, we had jumped on a moving sidewalk that carried us in the wrong direction back into the realm of the greenhouses where planting ceremonies were just taking place. We saw little groups of people standing around the cradle graves. They consisted in each case of the animator on duty, several bath attendants and gardeners, and finally the candidate, who had been thoroughly prepared by means of mud baths and wore the ecstatically intoxicated expression that I had seen on BH's features. With tightly closed eyes, these candidates seemed to be listening to angels' voices or to be experiencing unspeakable love dreams while the animator recited something, presumably a poem, and the gardeners sprinkled the naked, unresisting figures with light water. We glided slowly past, trying to make ourselves inconspicuous. Once or twice people called after us. It's a miracle that we weren't stopped and captured. One of the things that helped us was the fact that BH was carrying the jug of elixir on top of his head in the manner of the bath attendants. While my friend couldn't speak much, he was slowly regaining his strength and his cleverness in spite of our discouraging odyssey that not only taxed our physical and mental powers but also sapped our hope and confidence. Without a doubt, the jug on BH's head saved us from the most ticklish situation in which we were involved. We had left the hothouses far behind and were wandering around the daisy fields in search of the outer wall when we suddenly ran into a very long column of white smocks coming toward us. It was presumably a new shift of enumerators going on duty. I punched BH in the ribs and indicated that we had no recourse but to join the column. The spongy, unical figures trudged along indifferently. I was addressed repeatedly and gave indistinct, grudging answers. That was exactly the right thing to do, for all life down here was indistinct and grudging. And yet I knew that our fate was hanging by a hair. I had to restrain myself to keep from shouting with joy when I recognized a section of the daisy fields that we had passed on our earlier tour of inspection. Now we couldn't miss the outer wall. We dropped behind. I pulled BH from the path into the field. We lay down among the daisies, crushing many of the flowering dead. When the column had disappeared and we had risen again, I tripped over something. It was the red thread of the wet nurse. The unfortunate woman had saved us a second time. We followed it to the outer wall, we squeezed through the grating of the drain, we were outside. We leaned against each other and drew deep breaths. From this point the differences in elevation were evident. We were standing on very low ground while the light reflections on the panes of the glass houses seemed to come from mountain heights. Far above us under the distant cloud ceiling ran many roads, or rather bridges. They were nothing but silvery bands suspended without supports, converging from all directions, gleaming through dusk and drizzle. It seemed utterly impossible to reach one of these highways. The inexplicable construction of these roads constituted just about the only bit of futuristic architecture as popularly conceived that I had observed during my entire stay in the astro-mental epoch. And this bit of utopian architecture was in the underworld. We began to move. That's very easily said. Actually, we tripped and stumbled over a surface that can best be compared with a very hot, very soft leather cushion. It was unsolidified rock and reminded me of the putty-like iron moor on Apostle Peter. I'll say nothing of the laborious difficulties of our wanderings, the most cruel of which was the uncertainty of our objective. I also refrained from describing in detail various moments of terror, as for instance the one when all the great void about us quivered and echoed with dog-like voices, barking and shouting the word Seigneur. We were sure that our escape had been discovered and that a pack of eloquent Cerberuses had been unleashed to track us down. We began to run like mad over the leathery surface, never stopping to think that there was no sense in running if our flight had been discovered. Suddenly the ground was no longer hot. A hangar-like building of reddish material loomed up ahead of us. But I couldn't make out anything clearly because perspiration and the eternal drizzle were trickling into my eyes. The first thing I saw was a sign, fresh spring water. And beneath the sign water was actually gushing out of an old-fashioned wooden pipe into a deep basin. The drink, which was unexpectedly ice-cold, revived even BH. "Why, now I can speak again," he said in an astonished tone. "And I believe we're on the right road, BH." I remarked. The reddish hangar-like building before us appeared to be a combination refreshment station and chapel. Over its Romanesque portal were the words, Sancti Illusioni. Saint Illusion? I asked. Do you know a saint by that name? Why certainly, FW, she's the patron saint of the Order of the Childlike Life. You don't need to answer if it taxes your strength. No, indeed, it's wonderful to have a free tongue again. Was this saint always named Illusion? Certainly not. That's her convent name, FW. And who was she really? A girl by the name of Loha who lost her face in a chemical accident, everything, eyes, nose, lips. But the cheerful sanctity of her soul was so great that she incessantly developed an inexhaustible supply of new faces out of her inner consciousness for everyone who looked at her. And everyone who saw her regarded her as the most beautiful creature in the world. I can understand the brothers of the childlike life, I mused out loud. It's very thoughtful and meaningful of them to dedicate this particular chapel to this saint here in the realm of retrogenesis and analysis. Retroevolution of living forms ad ovum is quite an accomplishment, even if you sometimes make a slip and produce catabolites. But to have a beautiful face when you have no face at all, that's far more, that's the divinity of man. Sancta Illusio ora pro nobis. We stepped through the portal into a vaulted hall filled with fresh air and the delicate light of dawn, a most refreshing change from the rainy autumn twilight. My guess had been correct. The building housed a little chapel and a larger room which was undoubtedly an infirmary or at least a haven of rest for the weary. Its purpose was indicated by a number of reclining chairs and couches lining the walls. A motionless figure lay on one of these couches. I couldn't believe my eyes, and so it took quite a little time before I recognized the ancestress of the Lofager household. GR3 was wrapped tightly in her dove-gray bridal veil. The black, tight-fitting helmet crowned her lovely little face, and her deep-set eyes surveyed us mockingly. Not the slightest detail of great-great-grandma's toilette was disarranged even after her long stay in the Stygian realm, which, as we know, is notoriously messy. She was in tip-top, one shape from head to foot, exhaled a faint aroma of her mysterious perfume, and seemed fresher and more rested than when we last had seen her. Her mental, ivory-tinted little hands lay quietly at her sides. "Well, at last," she said. "Why at last?" I asked, puzzled. You'll want to take off those hideous smocks, gentlemen, the ancestress suggested, and her courteous command seemed to express the idea that she had recognized us and wasn't taking us for officials of the Wintergarten. BH and I dutifully pulled the stolen smocks from each other's bodies, although it was possibly a little early to doff our disguise. I thought it might be the new shift, said the ancestress. I didn't know what she meant by new shift and asked foolishly, were you expecting us here, madam? I wasn't expecting anyone, she said mockingly and added, you weren't very gallant, seigneur, when you were so gallant as to let me precede you. Then it dawned on me. How could I guess, madam, that you didn't wish to? My descendants are simply ovets and they're scared to death of life. But then you would have stayed in the house all alone and you would have been exposed to depressions and fulfillment disappointments. At my age, she laughed a brittle laugh. All my disappointments have been fulfilled and all my fulfillments have been disappointed. I'm not afraid of any psychic artillery. Did I hear right? I exclaimed. You're a recalcitrant too, madam? Don't be impertinent, sir, she retorted majestically. I adore the Wintergarten and I shall visit it when I'm good and ready. But so far I'm not ready. Well, we're as young as we feel, I stammered in embarrassment. That's what we used to say back in my day. No, we're as young as we are. And at these words her aged, sunken eyes gleamed. It pleased me to find one of the most important experiences of advanced mankind confirmed once more, the experience of heterochronic time. For every individual each year meant a different measure of life. Greater for one, smaller for another. Up there, madam, I said, you're all alone now, without family, without anyone to care for you. We're always alone, she said sternly. The best that ever came out of me is still living up there. You're speaking of Lala, the sweet child. But now she belongs entirely to the victor. You missed your chance, seigneur. Oh, you haven't found out yet where life begins. And where does life begin, madam? Life begins at the point where you stop worrying. And that's no small matter, BH muttered. Yes, indeed, it's no small matter. I almost cringed before the personality of this aged astro-mental hag. It was incredible that even the brutal heat of this place didn't affect her. Have you considered, madam, I inquired, that a new world has probably arisen meanwhile, a new historical era, which you might find strange and inconvenient? She stared at me. Strange? But that's just what I'm curious about. Curious, BH repeated enthusiastically, pleased to contribute something to the conversation. I am proud, madam, I said, that you will go back with us if God is good. If anyone goes back, she corrected me, you will go back with me, gentlemen. She rose lightly and with the gesture of a woman of the world she rearranged her veil drapery. Here comes the new shift, she exclaimed, looking at the door. When I had first read the name of the Order Brothers of the Childlike Life on the wall of our room in the Wintergarten, it had filled me not only with surprise but also with some misgivings. Undoubtedly the name was based on the words of Christ, except ye become as little children, and so forth. To become a child, however, means to live in the complete present without a past and a future, a dimension that the adult does not know, the mundane reflection of divine timelessness. This was the deeper meaning of the childlike life. At the same time I sensed an overtone in this concept, an overtone traceable to the century to which I belonged and to its skepticism. At that time I had known a certain hypocritical childlike piety that believed itself to be in the full grace of God because it despised the intellect. But Christ didn't say we were to he children, he said we were to be his children. He demands a new childhood. It was a most pleasant disappointment. There wasn't a trace of hypocritical childlike piety about the 12 young fellows who came crowding through the door of our shelter, good-humored and noisily cheerful. I used the irreverent expression, young fellows *, even though I'm talking about monks who looked very much like our Capuchins. But their manner was so gaily unmonastic that the young fellows flowed involuntarily out of my pen. Incidentally, no writer could muster the wisdom and depth to do justice to the manner in which the Church guarded its rights down here in the underworld. The idea of eternal childhood was its reply to the retrovolution of man to the embryonic stage, and therefore it entrusted the problem of the Wintergarten to the brothers of the childlike life. In this manner it showed the right road and showed up the wrong one. And it was nothing short of inspiration that had made Saint Delusio, the patron saint of the pit of the Catabolites, the disillusionments personified. The 12 young monks who now stood around us in a friendly, laughing circle served the religious needs of the east wing of the Wintergarten from which we had just escaped. We had already learned that they were not permitted to administer the dying sacraments, but they heard confessions of those who felt the need, and they fed and refreshed all comers. I wasn't able to discover how many wings the Wintergarten comprised and how many brothers were simultaneously on duty. I only found out that these had just been relieved by another shift and were preparing to return to the Earth's surface. They were to have a well-deserved evening off after their hard work in the unbearable climate of the cavity. They showed neither exhaustion nor fatigue, however, although their brown cowls seemed to be made of very heavy, coarse material. Neither the ancestress nor we needed to explain why we had sought refuge here. People like us, to scramble a metaphor, were their daily bread, if not the seasoning on the bread. Last time we smuggled up 15 of them, said one of the monks, in 5 parties, and we got away perfectly smoothly through a whole chain of enumerators. And yet it was quite a trick last time compared with today, laughed another, because there are thousands of people crowding into the stations today, running away from the war. There won't be anything to it today. A perfect cinch, they chorused. A radiant youth with bright, blue eyes, undoubtedly the head of the group, took charge. The main thing is this: never think of the next moment. We shall climb the big stairs together, step by step. But the big stairs don't even exist if you convince yourself that each step is the last. I came down the big stairs, said the ancestress proudly. And don't look back, said one of them with an inscrutable smile. Don't look behind you in Hades. Where had I heard that before? The old stories, again and again. But I said, I simply can't understand why the management is so strict and doesn't permit return travel on the roads. That's easy, was the answer. They don't want any witnesses to talk out of school and to report that things aren't exactly the way the uranographer announces in his prospectus and his articles. No, that's not the real reason, the Radiant One shook his head. The management is ashamed of itself. Why is the management ashamed of itself? Because it has made death the handiwork of man, in other words, has made it imperfect. If you had your way, the ancestress grumbled, we wouldn't even have the park of the worker. A monk, who really looked like a child, clapped his hands. Now. Let's not have any silly arguments. Let's rather sing and dance a few prayers and draw out the seconds by inner joyfulness. We'll do no such thing, the Radiant One objected. Our friends have had enough of this bad air and fog and twilight. They want to get back upstairs. We'll get there at a good time when the war will be over and the danger is reduced. The eye of the young friar encompassed the ancestress, BH, and me with such loving kindness that I began to feel happy. I sensed the boyish friendliness emanating from this man and his companions, a spiritual force that was probably the result of specific exercises. A while ago, when all 12 of them had minimized the dangers that still lay before us, I had had some slight misgivings. The all-too childlike manner in which they tried to talk us out of our fear of the adventure had a tendency to produce the opposite effect on nervous people. Now, however, I had such full confidence in the Radiant One and his co-friars as though they weren't monks at all but the most experienced smugglers. They had brought some cowls out of the next room and began trying them on us. I was surprised to find that the one they chose for me was very light and pliable despite the coarse material and that it wasn't even warm. BH gave me a satisfied smile. GR3, however, made a scene. What do you think I am? She cried indignantly. I in a cowl with a hood? It's only for a little distance, the Radiant One coaxed. No distance is little enough for my vanity. I had only one mission in the and I'll remain true to it. What sort of mission, madam? I asked curiously. To be beautiful, replied the ancient hag, and she was impeccably beautiful even in her anger. And what was even stranger, this avowal of her beauty from the lips of a woman roughly 200 years old didn't sound in the least grotesque but natural and dignified. The monks put their heads together and finally one of them tried to make her see reason by the wrongest possible means. Look, Grandma, the object of the game is to keep anybody from seeing and identifying you. And what about you, Reverend Gentleman? She retorted pointedly, won't you see me and identify me? But even if I were all alone, I'd sooner lie down in the humus than make myself ridiculous. Probatum est, laughed the head of the friars. We'll get along without the disguise. Maybe we'll get along even better. And the rest of them joined in his hearty laughter. Somebody pulled the hood up over my head. I sat down on one of the couches, overcome by a strong feeling that all this had happened once before. Was this a faux connaissance, perhaps, or a déjà vu, as the psychologists call it? No. I really had been on the point once before of fleeing from pitiless pursuers in a monk's cowl. Marseille, July 1940. The Germans had occupied 2/3 of France. In a few days, so it was said, they would occupy the entire country. And I would be lost, for according to paragraph 19 of the Armistice Agreement, the French would have to surrender me and everybody like me. I was in a Dominican monastery. They were discussing the possibility of putting me and my fellow victims into cowls and smuggling us over the Spanish frontier. The only thing that restrained me from the adventure was the sight of 2 pseudo-monks who looked impossible in the garb. What a delicate feeling for the proprieties the ancestress has, I thought to myself at this recollection. The whole business gave me a very strange feeling because here was a situation that repeated itself after endless eons and, moreover, here was a harebrained scheme hatched in the year 1940 that was finally executed in the 11th cosmic capital year of Virgo. I was still following this line of thought when the brothers of the childlike life were leading us into the crypt under the altar consecrated to St. Lugio, and from there, through a narrow door, into a corridor. Single file, the Radiant One commanded in a humorous tone. This ancient military command seemed to have been preserved in the discipline of the order. We went down the passage in Indian file amid the joking and laughter of the monks who constantly tried to keep us from feeling the terrific tension that held us in its spell. When we had left the corridor, however, and stood facing the enormous circular stairway, I quaked with dizziness. The stairs resembled those in a round tower, only the tower was missing. They grew upward in a gray, metallic spiral, so high that we could only see its lower part. After a few turns it vanished in the dusk and fog of the subterranean, autumnal landscape. I couldn't suppress my dread at the thought of climbing these stairs. My God, I sighed, even in my youth nobody expected anything like this of me. When the Campanile in Venice was reconstructed after its collapse, they put in a nice comfortable elevator. The Radiant One patted my shoulder gently. Nothing to it, my friend. Anybody who wants to get up has to climb. I was silent, fearing the sudden heart failure that the animator had predicted. Insanely enough, I had no objections to dissolving and vanishing, but I was afraid of the failure of my dubious body. Maybe retrogenesis would have been better after all. Haha, at last you're beginning to appreciate the great accomplishment. That's the way it is with all innovations. Good old conservatism turns out in the end to be nothing but being stuck in a rut. I know this staircase, said the ancestress, and I hope no one will imagine that I'm afraid of it. Nothing to be afraid of, Grandma, said several of the friars. You'll float right up like an angel, Grandma. That's enough of that, Gr. Carrot exclaimed angrily. I'm not Grandma to you. I'm a great-great-grandmother, and even that isn't quite right because I've dropped one of the greats. The friars related that they had sometimes been required to go up and down the big stairs 3 or 4 times in succession. In the course of all these speeches and conversations we scarcely noticed that we had already made several turns. 2 monks had taken the lovely old crone between them and were carrying her. A friar was walking behind me and another behind BH, pushing us with strong hands. And so our climb wasn't much more than a pleasure trip. A number of the monks dropped behind. This was done because the enumerators passed only the 12 monks who were being relieved. A somewhat guttural voice began to sing. Oh, dearest women and men, we brothers of childlike life, we know no struggle and strife, no turning backward again. We're far more than halfway up, the Radiant One said suddenly. But that's impossible, I replied in honest surprise. We've hardly begun to climb. That, laughed the young prior, is because we've been telling you constantly not to think of the next turn. It was quite true. The monks developed a physical and psychic rhythm of such power as to force BH and me to surrender ourselves completely and joyously to the activity of stair climbing. All at once my good friend said, It's too bad that we're almost there. I wish there were more stairs to climb. That's what our clients always say, nodded the Radiant One, bringing up the rear of our little party. And he added, in a moment we'll be on the main road. I'd like to make the following requests. Stick close together, don't talk, and don't turn around. We had been told that the road in the direction of the Wintergarten would be crowded with people, and it was. The throng was so great that there were traffic jams from time to time and the flood of humanity froze. All these insane people preferred premature retrogenesis to life in a world imperiled by the most modern of wars, not unlike Lofager and his clan who, to be sure, had hastened ahead of hoi polloi and had thus assured themselves of prompt service on the part of animators, gardeners, and bath attendants. The newcomers here would no doubt have to wait a long time for their happy ends. The white smocks no longer leaned indifferently against the railings but formed solid cordons with their backs against the stream. The Radiant One winked at me delightedly. The situation was more favorable than ever. We closed in solidly in order to form a compact group of cowls. The monks broke into a choral chant of such strength and vigor that it filled even the void Stygian space. Our solid phalanx advanced against the stream like the sharp prow of a ship, the ancestress in the center, BH and I behind her. The monks formed the perimeter. Although the ancestress had been carried up the stairs, she now gave the impression of hoary old age. I must confess that she now looked old to me, old without any qualification. This appearance of old age, however, was not manifested by weakness but rather by an aura of quiet fury that enveloped her. Her condition made me more and more uncomfortable from moment to moment. We had just passed the first cordon of enumerators. The muscular choir of monks plowed through the white smocks who turned aside bashfully, unpleasantly affected by the powerful voices of the brothers of the childlike life. One more line of guards was ahead of us and then the game would be won. A moderate distance away we saw the smooth wall of rock called the station because the Camere Caritatis landed there. I am in a position to describe the next occurrence with the greatest accuracy because it seemed to take place in my own soul and to concern me. By some sort of astro-mental act, everything that went on inside the ancestress and motivated her insane action was reflected within me to the point of painfulness. I felt the horrid temptation to disobey orders. I felt the woman's defiant stubbornness. I felt her wild arrogance, her unrestrained arrogance, her hatred of the monks, her saviors. And behind all of it I felt her aloofness, her indifference, her what the hell do I care attitude that kept her from taking the next few steps and from taking the elevator back up into the world of the living. Was this indifference a true desiderium origines? And so it happened that when we reached the last line of enumerators, GR3 stopped suddenly and turned around gracefully. For an instant our entire group stopped and the chorus was interrupted. 3 seconds later, however, it began again stronger than ever. I felt a poke in the ribs and stumbled ahead. Although I didn't particularly love the ancestress, I tried to toss the green rope of the wet nurses in her direction. It was the radiant one who intercepted it. But the ancestress had been swallowed by the throng that was moving toward the Wintergarten. A few steps farther on we reached the station of the Brothers of the Childlike Life. Everything went smoothly as peanut oil. Whether Lala's great-great-grandmother, or, according to her own confession, her great-great-great-grandmother had reached the end of her astro-mental life, that's something I can't say. One shouldn't be a bit surprised, however, if she had changed her mind once more. The 25th chapter. Wherein I lose my friend, view the ruins of the Jebel, and witness an heroic act of self-sacrifice. The state of the world as we found it on our return to the surface did not surprise me too greatly. In my own, much more ponderous lifetime I had discovered that the historico-political aspect of a nation could change beyond recognition not only overnight but in the course of a single hour. I am thinking particularly of the end of the First World War, the November days of the year 1918, which I spent in the heart of the defeated Central European powers. That war too had been precipitated by a shot fired by a fanatical and irresponsible youth, which had eliminated a prince of very little personal importance. But since at that time the population was greater, the factions more numerous, the conditions more complicated, the motives more chaotic, the weapons more primitive than so many eons later, it was only natural that that war lasted 4 years and not a scant 12 hours as the present one of the most remote future. Measured by the last war of the planet, incidentally, which had taken exactly 3 3/10 minutes, this was a rather protracted campaign. We must not forget, however, that this war had been forced upon both parties, Panopolis as well as the jungle, and that the guilty ones, the silly arms collectors, were nothing but clumsy conspirators who had no efficient military organization. As a transient visitor in this world of the future, I am, of course, in a position to record only the immediate cause but not the deeper motives. Beyond a doubt, however, such deeper motives existed, even if they were nothing more than the polar tension of the contrast between Panopolis and the jungle. The reader will recall my repeated confession that I saw all these future happenings as through a refracting prism, that, in other words, their character and meaning were somewhat distorted. An old proverb says, veritas vincit, truth is victorious. Unfortunately, this adage is an idealistic overestimate and misjudges life's realities. By the end of the days of mankind, of course, truth will have conquered. Until then, however, the opposite is usually the case, victoria vera facit, victory makes truth. Every historical era reflects the face of the most recent victor. That was true here. It was close to midnight when we arrived on the surface in the general vicinity of the former East Side district. The star-sown astromental sky arched over us, and the world of men beneath it was beginning to assume the face of the jungle. Thus my last impression of astromental civilization was that it had ceased to exist and that it was making way for something new, something that so far was very indistinct and inchoate. At the same time, however, the astromental attainments seemed to be functioning without interruption. The heavenly bulletin board where the celestial lights lined up to form today's evening stars brought new dispatches every 2 minutes. To my surprise, however, the tone of these notices was totally different from last night and the night before. The evening stars lauded the jungles and their vigorous, unsophisticated inhabitants who were not corrupted by decadent morals and whose ideal was an active, busy life instead of aimless play and sterile speculation. The sidereal newspaper, moreover, reported on the fate of the surviving conspirators, the arms collectors whose idiotic hatred was responsible for the Great Purge. Many of them, it was stated, had already been captured, and in spite of the late hour the juridical commissions were searching the archives of the remotest past for appropriate forms of death punishment formerly used on traitors. Death sentences? I couldn't believe my eyes. But there in the sky the terrible word gleamed in extensive, demotic script. Only a few hours ago, down in Hades, in the cavity of death, the animator had severely reprimanded me for uttering the indecent word death, and now it could be read clearly and distinctly on the night sky. And the people who stared upward didn't faint at all. The change had come much too fast even for me, a hard-boiled victim of world history. Suddenly I understood Lo Fager and all those like him, and I respected them from the bottom of my heart because they had preferred to become daisies a few years earlier than necessary rather than be untrue to themselves. The report on the captured conspirators was followed by a lengthy editorial insisting with a certain degree of anxiety that the useful arts which mankind had learned in the course of its earthly career must not be despised and that the beneficent institutions should be retained by reformed human society, even though the latter was based wholly on those magnificent retreats so shamefully miscalled jungles. This quotation of Lojoel's words made me laugh. Why the dirty laugh? BH asked gloomily. I'm laughing because I can imagine the look on the urinographer's face while he's scribbling this editorial. Tomorrow they'll probably kick him out and put in one of their own men. What a novel idea, BH, I mocked, tremendously novel. He pointed silently up at the sky where another report was beginning to line up. It read as follows: Imminent end of Selenozuja. The Committee for the New World Constitution has just met to debate a proposal for the abolition of Selenozuja. The institution of the lunar consecrated Geo-Archon, the powerless powerful ruler, the responsible irresponsible president without a name, failed so miserably in the face of a relatively trivial danger that his place will be taken by a Geo-General, an expert in psychic artillery. The sentry booth of the world majordomo will soon be replaced by a more dignified official residence. Too bad, I said, too bad, and I stopped reading because my neck was getting stiff from looking up at the sky. My impression that Panopolis was beginning to assume the face of the jungle probably resulted from the fact that we visited chiefly places where the change was most apparent. It might have been different in the residential sections, perhaps even in the geodrome. In those places the resistance of astromental culture might not have been so quickly broken. Here, however, in the region of the former East Side, the center of which was formed by the Corso between the two gateways, here in the district of the prolific families and of the weary and heavy-laden, the celebration of the social reform was in full swing. Although these weary and heavy-laden weren't weary and heavy-laden at all, although they were well-fed and well-clothed by the sidereal factories of the worker, it was all the same. In a world without economics and without social distinctions, they were the same old weary and heavy-laden, for it's a well-known fact that man lives not on bread alone but also on the gratification of his self-esteem. I need not emphasize that the weary and heavy-laden of the former East Side constituted the revolutionary strata of astromental society, and that joy and jubilation reigned in the district between the two ruined gates. Not because there was any prospect of life becoming brighter, but because the people who had looked down their noses at them would have nothing to say anymore. Crowds of jungle people were already here, men and women, many of them in their peasant smocks with glittering silver buttons, with red tassel caps and little bells on their mustaches. These peasants, however, were very quiet and cautious, even a bit bashful, while the city populace cheered frantically and went out of their way to fraternize. It might even be said that these astromental proletarians kowtowed to the reserved jungle people in a strange sort of perverted snobbery. In explanation of this attitude, I shall have to add, however, that the men carrot from Mountain Town hadn't come empty-handed. They had brought along many kegs of their brown beer, and the astromental people, who had never tasted anything like it, were all a hittle high and irresponsible. A charming historical reversal, by the way, the Redskins corrupting the palefaces with firewater. The Mountain Townites, for their part, had captured a considerable number of travel puzzles and were having a wonderful time changing their localities like wild. For me, it was one of the great mysteries of this war that the harmonizers continued to perform their duties so faultlessly. But even this wasn't anything novel, for I knew from earlier experience that certain basic functions of life continue to operate in spite of hell, high water, war, and revolution. Another strange thing was that the people had lighted campfires and were sitting around them. I repeat, they were sitting, a thing they wouldn't have dared to do 12 hours ago, at least not in public. According to Lojol, sitting was a reactionary posture. I had taken BH's arm. We were strolling along slowly, enjoying the divinely fresh night air after the incubator heat of the winter garden. Do you remember Lenin's famous saying? I asked. Revolutions are the locomotives of world history? Locomotives run forward and backward. This one seems to run backward. What of it? My friend retorted sagely. It's running. When all space is curved, why should man alone maintain a straight direction? I was about to ask this question when we passed the entrance that led to King Saul's house. On it was a metal sign with the inscription, Lo Saul Minyan Man, official Jew of the era. Under it was pasted a paper with 2 words neatly written on it, out wandering. I'd like to bet, I laughed, that Minyan Man isn't out wandering but is safely locked up in his curio shop. And he doesn't know whether to curse or bless his darling son for these terrible reforms that are being visited on the world once again when they've hardly had time to get used to the last ones. You may be right, BH nodded. I know I'm right. King Saul is still busy segregating himself. What's going to become of us? BH sighed deeply. You're the guide, I said maliciously, suppressing a secret wish directed at the jungle on Lala's account. Let's go to the Park of the Worker, BH suggested. That's the best place for us to recover our strength. The Park of the Worker was also flooded with tremendous throngs. At a considerable distance we could read a luminous sign hanging in the air, unless hostilities on both sides cease by 12 o'clock midnight, the worker of the era will go on strike. It sounded like an effective threat. Without a doubt it was much more serious for the conspirators and arms collectors than for the artillery generals of the jungle, and properly so, as everyone will agree. After all, the worker was a worker and his sympathies were therefore with the underdogs. At the same time, however, he was careful to guard the principle of neutrality by directing his threat of strike against both parties. The jungle people, to be sure, lived on the fruits of the earth and were therefore independent of the astral food from the Valley of Springs and Forces, while the astramentals, lacking all agriculture, were menaced by starvation. The workers' threat to go on strike had completely served its purpose. After the trans-shadow disintegrators and the existence extinguishers of the conspirators had done more or less damage in the jungles and had dissolved a few thousand people into thin air, they ceased firing, if only because the astromental citizens evinced no sympathy and approval of the coup, as the arms collectors had hoped, but only disgust and anger. Never in the history of the world had a civilization been destroyed more stupidly and more wantonly. The various Constantines, on the other hand, had succeeded in their purposes long before sundown. Wailing and gnashing of teeth reigned in all sections of Panopolis, and there were not enough first-aid stations to accommodate those wounded by depression projectiles. The articles of capitulation were signed at the beginning of the first night watch. They were signed by the unfortunate person who had taken the place of the last Selenozusian. Obviously he signed only with a symbol and no name, for he had none. The most significant paragraph consisted of a single, brief sentence: the boundaries between the astromental residential desert and the colorful oases are hereby abolished. At one stroke, as we see, everything had changed. The jungles had for good reasons been promoted to colorful oases, and from their perspective these oases for equally good reasons referred to the seat of an almost superhumanly spiritualized civilization as the astromental residential desert. We were informed of these developments by feverishly excited people who were too agitated to notice that I was an alien in a strange garb. The monks had taken back their cowls when they left us. So much for the progress of this brief war, if it could be called a war at all, although it had exacted a great toll of victims. But we heard something else that sounded incredible and that filled me with abhorrence. Some of the rebels had been killed, the greater part had surrendered. But there were still a few heroes or holdouts or gangsters who had entrenched themselves with their trans-shadow disintegrators at inaccessible places where they could not be reached by psychic artillery. But they did not direct their destructive pipettes, as might have been expected, against the so-called oases. Instead, and it was too monstrous for reason to grasp, they tried to destroy the greatest and best thing their own world had produced, the world for which they claimed to be fighting. In a word, the object of their last destructive frenzy was the Jebel, and the report was that they had been successful. Someone might think that the motive of these patriots was to keep the Temple of Learning from falling into the hands of the enemy. But no, that wasn't it. I'll swear it wasn't. The Lodos really hated the Jebel more fiercely than the jungle. The shameful defeat bared their deep hatred. That's the only explanation I can find for this atrocity that made me shudder and grieve. I count it a high honor to have been taken into the presence of the worker at this hour. He was so busy he didn't know what to do first, for all the responsibilities of tottering civilization rested on his shoulders. I don't know to whom or to what I owed this distinction, certainly not to the violet wrist rosette. It had lost its value as completely as the medal on my chest. I seemed to have an unfortunate penchant for decorations from doomed governments. Yet I kept both of them with me. All the brothers, sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons of the worker clan appeared to be on duty today, not to speak of the assistants. One of these 7-foot giants cleared a path through the throng for us. Tens of thousands of women and children crowded the playground. The parks of the workers throughout the world had all served as places of refuge, for, be it said to the credit of the jungle, only a few projectiles had struck them. This doesn't mean, however, that I'm conceding any degree of humaneness to Constantine and his ilk. Far from it. I don't want to commit the psychological error of Rousseau, the encyclopedists, the Saint-Simonists, the parlor socialists, the Lojoels, who maintain that the mere fact of not belonging to the ruling class makes one a better man. Constantine and his ilk had every reason to protect the workers' sidereal machinery in order to take possession of it themselves later on. Every time a lower civilization conquers a higher one, the victor first annexes the superior attainments of the vanquished. At this midnight hour, the malachite green hollow with its countless springs and fountains of forces afforded an overwhelming spectacle. The ground all about vibrated with mysterious activity, and not only the ground but also the ether all the way up to the intermundia. The stellar rays shooting down into the alabaster bowls and rocketing back again to the heavens were more brilliantly colored than by day. They were definitely more visible, though none the less ghostly. It was a perfect downpour, a cloudburst of beneficent sidereal forces descending upon man and returning to the stars. Profound silence reigned in the hollow, although thousands of jungle people were assembled here. In deepest reverence they observed the magnificent spectacle, the character and meaning of which they could not grasp. From afar we heard the golden lion's growl of the worker at midnight. Of course you're astonished, you're dumb with surprise. You can sate your hunger by feasting your eyes. I recognized the cheerful giant's doggerel at once. It hadn't improved after such a day of hard work and devoted effort. But the content of his rhyme was true. If you focused your full attention on the miraculous play of the nutritive rays, you not only felt better but you also experienced a sensation of satiation and warmth. In other words, calories were optically assimilated. I mention this detail because it might point in the direction of completely spiritualized alimentación of an even more future. My reverie about a human race fed in such an ethereal manner was interrupted by the unique laugh of the worker who towered above us like a rugged monolith. Well, Seigneur, you've given me lots of worry. What became of you when you left in a hurry? All day long I've had an obsession that our guest had been wounded by a depression. He stopped with a frown, stamped his foot, and growled, "After midnight my rhythm always gets bad. And I need a little morning song for my solar plexus," I said. The worker's laugh was like a deep-toned bell. "Then you'll have to wait until morning." "Seigneur." I turned enthusiastically to BH. "Do you know why I'm so fond of our worker? He's the only person in the world who can laugh without laughing at anybody." While we sipped a warm drink, the worker asked us how we had spent the day. "We escaped from the Wintergarten," I confessed truthfully. He was honestly shocked. "Well, damn my buttons and strike me pink, you need the hospital now, I think. There's a cozy bed and a square meal too in the workers' infirmary for each of you." "Where's the workers' infirmary?" I inquired curiously. "It's under our feet and it's very large," he replied, scraping the ground lightly. "My daughters and daughters-in-law are in charge. My granddaughters too make a splendid impression." "I see, they are all in the nursing profession," I involuntarily completed his rhyme. "They've nursed most of the wounded back to health," the worker nodded proudly. "They have a panacea, a cure-all, I suppose?" "It's very simple," the worker laughed. "Our women radiate." "What do your women radiate?" "Beauty, good common sense, and quiet. Come along with me, you ought to try it." "No, Mr. Worker," I said. "It sounds very attractive. Many thanks. But that's not what I need. I want something else. We're not sick, neither my friend BH nor I, although we had a pretty hard time of it in the uterus matrice terrae. Still, neither of us needs hospitalization. I'll admit that I can't think of anything more pleasant than to be radiated at by radiant young women, especially when they radiate beauty, quiet, and good common sense. But I can't afford it right now. Something else is calling to me incessantly. I should only like to ask the worker of the era to do me a little favor. Please press both of us to your blue apron breast as you did to me once before. That made me feel so wonderful." "Well, my boy, that's only fair," the worker jingled happily. "You refuse a woman's tender care, but instead of it you demand the strength that I, the worker, am here to lend. Damn it all, even my rhymes are rotten after midnight." Well, come on. He seized me with his left arm and BH with his right and pressed us both mightily to his chest. From his mountainous insides we heard the golden, growling laugh bubbling like a hidden spring. An unspeakable sense of well-being streamed from his body into mine as it had done once before. I began to breathe slowly and deeply. With a feeling of complete peace and calm, I looked at the tremendous crowd consisting of victors in peasant smocks and vanquished in pastel-colored veil draperies. I felt my fatigue fall from my shoulders like a worn-out garment. 2 minutes more of this vitalizing current, I thought, and I'll be ready for anything. At the same time, I wasn't equal to this unbounded contentment and began to sob convulsively. I distinctly remembered that the same thing happened to my friend. We were standing somewhere on the iron gray sod, BH and I, all alone, just as at our first meeting. The park of the worker lay behind us. We were refreshed and strengthened by his revitalizing physical contact as well as by the soup and goat cheese that he had served us. Now we had to make up our minds. That is, I didn't have to make up my mind at all. I knew exactly where I was going next. Why didn't you accept the worker's offer? BH said, and I distinctly felt that he had something on his mind, presumably some sort of a grudge. I didn't like the sound of the words hospital and infirmary, old man, I replied, in spite of the worker's radiant ladies. I would rather sleep outside than in an astro-mental hospital bed. We probably will have to sleep outside, FW, for I haven't the heart to return to Lophage's empty house. And I haven't any residence of my own. Haven't we forgotten how to sleep by this time, BH? At any rate, I'm wide awake. It wasn't I who started to talk about sleeping but you. Let's not beat around the bush, BH. You've got something on your mind. What is it? I have an evil foreboding. An evil foreboding? In regard to what? BH didn't answer. I had to repeat the question. An evil foreboding? In regard to yourself. In that case, I wouldn't have opened my mouth. So it's in regard to me? You're right, FW. It's in regard to you. Well, now listen, BH, didn't I put up a pretty good battle in the Winter Garden? You know, much as I'm concerned about my own welfare, I'm completely impervious to danger. I'm proud to be without imagination. BH sat down on the iron gray sod and drew me down beside him so that I was now sitting for the first time on this earth-encompassing carpet and looking up at the strange, glittering night sky. It was a curious feeling to be sitting on this nerve grass, dry as paper and unyieldingly tough as hemp. Yes, you not only put up a very good battle, FW, my reincarnated friend began, but you distinguished yourself by your energy and ingenuity and saved both of us. I not only am deeply in your debt, but I'm ashamed of myself as a native of the era for having failed you. As a native of the era you had to fail, but that isn't the right word because you were ready for retrogenesis from the start. And I've been wondering, FW, whether it wouldn't have been better and more dignified in spite of all risks. Turnip mannequins, catabolites, nemodrome, and everything else. I don't understand you, BH. Weren't you sick with horror and disgust too? You can't ever understand me, FW. You didn't get the right slant on the Winter Garden, chiefly on account of your resistance, and your attitude influenced me too. It was the same old conviction I had found in Lophager. The conquering of death by means of retrogenesis was the sacred taboo of all who had been astro-mentally reared. It may be, my friend, I said after a while, that I wasn't equal to the Winter Garden and that my offended primitivism attracted and unmasked all the evils down there. But you mustn't forget that for me and my time death was a holy ordinance of God and man has no business meddling with it. I certainly don't minimize the idea and the practice of your detour around death, but its blasphemous character can't be denied any more than its abstruseness and unnaturalness. Now you've just touched on the important point. FW, man has always tended to designate bad habits as holy ordinances. One of these bad habits was his passive acceptance of dying. You can't deny that all of human history is a continued, stubborn effort to reduce the authority of God and to transfer more and more of it to the control of man. So it is, I replied amicably, but you should hear the Grand Bishop's opinion on this point. And what about your evil foreboding? I smiled. Is it connected with my reactionary recalcitrance? On the contrary, he rejoined briskly, my evil foreboding is connected with your incredible adaptability, my friend. Disappointed in me, BH? Disappointed? Heavens, no, FW. I only had something quite different in mind when I summoned you from an inconceivable distance. I imagined you would come to us as a mild phantom, a shining shadow, that you would share a little of our life with us and look around and observe the world. Instead, you came out of your absence charged with life, with whirlwinds of will and of energy. That's why I'm worried about you. Think of all the things you've had to do. You were umpire in the greatest controversy of all times. You did comic calisthenics with the best of them. You were on the most intimate terms with the high floater. You were appointed as negotiator in the jungle. As a recalcitrant in the winter garden, you fought for our lives for 10 hours while I hung as a dead weight around your neck. And the big winding stairs topped it all off. Now what's next? It's bound to lead to a bad end. Why is it bound to lead to a bad end? Because you're extending yourself too far, FW, beyond all permissible limits. That's the worst vice imaginable. Virtue stays within modest bounds. That's why concentration, virtue, and health are identical. But vice reaches for everything and tries to egotize everything. And your dissipation breaks all known records. You're trying to combine the most uncombinable antitheses in your little existence. Mark my words, you'll end up in an awful mess. And I'll be the goat who's to blame for the whole business. What sort of a mess? Suppose you should fall ill. With these insatiable dissipations of your undisciplined will, you're bound to become sick. Is that any reason to go to the hospital beforehand and to have the workers' women radiate at me? Wouldn't that be a dissipation too? Listen to my suggestion, FW. I'll take you to the nearest caravansary. You lie down. I'll stay with you and watch that nothing happens to you. You're a good friend, BH. I know it. But I'll have to turn your suggestion down. I hear a call inside me that keeps calling insistently. Undoubtedly, it's a mental call. You see to what extent I've been assimilated. Someone's calling me from the Jebel. BH was so frightened at the word Jebel that he turned pale. It was noticeable even in the bluish star daylight. The Jebel, he exclaimed. But that's out of the question. Why is it out of the question? On account of the trans-shadow disintegrators? My evil foreboding just now was connected with the Jebel. And with us Astromental's foreboding is foreknowing. And what does your foreknowing tell you? That you'll meet your end at the Jebel, your relative end, naturally. Doesn't my unconscionably long sojourn here have to come to an end sometime, BH? And I'd sooner choose the Jebel for my end than the winter garden. You've probed that. I've only probed half of my statement. Besides, with due respect to your foreknowledge, it may be just as unfounded as our knowledge frequently is. I had been on my feet for some time and was gently twisting the travel puzzle around in my hand. BH, standing beside me, bowed his large head. He smiled dreamily as he said, I ought to knock the mental bowl out of your hand and take it away from you. Well, BH, I laughed, what are you waiting for? That wasn't a nice thing to say, FW, he said gently. You know I won't knock it out of your hand. I can't change you any more than you can change me. Let's remember the words of Gr. Carrot, life begins when you stop worrying. A silly maxim, by the way. For life really begins when you have something to worry about. When you're ready, let's go, said BH dryly, taking hold of me so that we would be at the Jebel together in the next instant. But I retreated 2 steps. Wait, BH. It's possible after all that something might happen to me or to you. So let's say goodbye decently in the old-fashioned way. I thank you for drawing my name out of the alphabet. My consciousness has been immeasurably enriched by you. You made me a regal present. 2 things I'll know for all eternity, that we two can never disappear out of the world and that it's always possible to meet again. And in spite of various accidents and incidents, everything was awfully nice and tremendously interesting. I shouldn't have to tell the reader that the words awfully nice and tremendously interesting were a screen behind which I concealed my emotions. BH, however, the more refined and more sensitive of us, shook my hand silently, looked at me briefly, and quickly lowered his eyes. And I shook the pale pellets into the proper little holes with expert fingers and sent my keenly directed desire toward the Jebel. When our objective lay before us, I thought I had made a mistake. There was no Jebel at all, only a gigantic pile of ruins, huge blocks of crystal and heaps of prismatic fragments over which delicate rainbows of refracted starbeams trembled. The trans-shadow disintegrators had made rubble and ashes of the most sublime symbolic structure that mankind will ever erect. That's no mere metaphorical phrase, for some portions of the crystalline substance glowed through the night like streams of lava, and colossal masses of scoria plunged down with the thunderous clash of cosmic bass drums and cymbals. Streams of water hissed through the titanic ruin, and an unspeakable flickering and fluttering betrayed the concern of the stars that had lost their earthly home. The chronosophers of all the lamassaries, forefeelers, marvelers, star rovers, and the schoolboys of the planet classes had congregated about the vast scene of destruction and were standing in an arc of such size that its ends could not be seen. They did not permit anyone to approach the bottle-green, ice-like border area. They made frantic warning signs as we came near. I didn't know what was going on. Were we in the danger zone? A poisonous silence that I shall never forget hung in the air. BH suddenly seemed to grasp the situation. He took hold of my hand to pull me away. He began to run madly. I shouted angrily and tore my hand loose. At that instant he stumbled and fell. But the terrible thing was that he didn't fall. He had no time to fall. In the split second between stumbling and falling, the trans-shadow disintegrator, this ridiculous blowpipe, this damned museum piece out of a dead past, had dissolved him into nothingness. He was not only invisible as I had once been, he didn't even exist anymore. He was erased, exterminated, along with every last one of his 26 trillion healthy cells. It took me a long time to grasp what had happened. His foreknowledge had not deceived him. The fact that I still possessed my body was an error in calculation. My unpredictable misconduct in tearing myself loose from him had saved me, contrary to all the rules. I regretted it deeply at this moment. I dropped to the ground, stricken with grief. A terrible thought crushed me with its weight. I am alone in the world. Had lost my friend, but I was not alone in the world. A group of young men who had witnessed the disaster ran toward me and took me in their midst. I recognized them at once by their muscular, astrally developed bodies. They belonged to the lamasery of the astropaths, the gymnasts who depicted the character of the nearer stars and their constellations in pantomimic and acrobatic exhibitions. They didn't sympathize with me, they weren't horrified, they didn't make long speeches, but immediately began a round dance. Pain, said one, is interruption of movement. Healing, responded another, is resumption of movement. Alip, Seigneur, whispered a third right beside me, relax, let go, lean. I scarcely touched the ground as I ran over the surface, supported by them. At this point I must again obviate a possible misunderstanding. The flying, or rather floating, trip over the immense, starlit ruin of the Jebel, on which I now set out with the help of the young astropaths, had nothing in common with the well-known dream-flying or dream-floating. That happens to all of us occasionally at night. I must repeat emphatically that all such experiences, unusual as they may seem to us people of the 20th century, were no dream visions but unquestionable realities in the 11th cosmic capital year of Virgo. In other words, I'm not speaking of a dream or even a vision, but of an actual flight over the ruins of the Jebel for which the astrogymnasts needed no machines other than their own bodies. The reader, remembering the account of their activities in the pertinent chapter, will, of course, take my word for it. The youths carried me as lightly as though I were a downy feather. And I really wasn't much heavier. The explanation lay in the fact that the destruction of the Jebel had released the various degrees of regulated gravitation in its interior, and these had now cancelled each other to such an extent that the gravitation pervading the space above the ruin was extremely low. We flew along at a moderate altitude. But this altitude and the starlight were sufficient for me to survey the entire area of the demolished, mighty, artificial mountain. I almost cried aloud with surprise, why, the Jebel is an eye. My young flight companions appeared to smile. Didn't you know that? The Jebel is Gia's eye. And one of them added sadly, it was Gia's eye. No doubt about it. It was Gia's eye, the destroyed eye of the Earth planet which man had placed here ages ago so that it might look out consciously into cosmic space. From the altitude at which we were floating along in a mild current of air, I could plainly distinguish the various parts of the eye. There was first of all the enormous eyeball, suspended and freely movable in a circular earth socket. The forward cleft of this socket was covered with the bottle-green, ice-like surface which served as an approach to the actual mountain, the eyeball, and to the numerous gateways that led into its interior. Viewed from above, it was obvious that the crystal globe of the eye was not completely demolished. On the contrary, its form was much more distinctly preserved than the perspective from the valley had indicated. I could easily distinguish the cornea, iris, retina, and pupil as far as these organic structures were indicated by the architecture. Only the uppermost cupola, the highest dome, the pupil, had been completely shattered, and the rooms to which I referred as the attics of the Star Over at the time we inspected the Jebel gaped open to the sky. The design of the pupil consisted of many polygonal facets, a feature of insect rather than human eyes as far as I know. The eyeball, the main part of the Jebel, could not be seen from below because of the rock formations and crags that surrounded and towered above it and gave it the appearance of a characteristic mountain peak. They took the place of the lids and eyelashes that protect the precious, vulnerable eye. Now they were blasted away and had crashed down into the plain, and the eyeball itself seemed to have sunk far down into its socket. The magnificent and tragic spectacle beneath our flight showed how man humanizes nature and how nature again and again naturalizes man in endless, cruel alternation. For the events of this day were nothing but the renaturalization of man, his surrender to the blind forces that persisted in him just as they had in the beginnings of mankind. And there was profound logic in the circumstance that the attack on the refined astromental civilization had not erupted from the jungle but from the bosom of this arrogant culture itself. This dismal thought brought Bh's end so sharply into my consciousness that I groaned. I'm to blame for his death. He tried to save me. But I saved myself by preventing him from saving me. So I let him perish alone. Movement, movement, the voices about me cried. Movement won't do any good, I moaned. What was the use of escaping from the winter garden? He implored me to let him become a baby. It's really a very pleasant method and you don't vanish all at once. When the astropaths noticed my useless remorse, they spoke a few words to each other. I felt them descending to the pupil of the Jebel, and a few breaths later we landed on a crystal platform. It was a fairly spacious, circular surface, the highest point of the shattered cupola of the Jebel, the roof of chronosophy, so to speak. A huge jagged hole, its edges shimmering like jewels, gaped in the middle of the platform. I might call it a shell hole if I didn't know that a direct hit of a trans-shadow disintegrator would scarcely be content to produce such a harmless result. Be that as it may, a cloud of smoke issuing from the hole indicated that the opening led far down into the interior of the Jebel, where fires were undoubtedly raging in the various halls, thinking chambers, and studios of the lamassaries, perhaps even in the precincts of the arachnodrome, and that the material of which the mountain was constructed had been transformed into streams of lava by the terrific heat, the violence of the explosions, and the atomic disintegration. It didn't require much imagination to conceive the lamassaries of the thaumazounts and xenospasts as molten infernos and to realize that there was little hope for anyone trapped there, though he had easily survived the terrors of the most distant intermundia. But there were only voluntary victims in the Jebel, as I was to discover later. The platform where my young comforters had deposited me was bordered by a balustrade, and along it a line of men in ash-gray cowls stood motionless and silent. I diagnosed them without difficulty as old men, as forafeelers, and before long I was informed that they were the governing board of the Xenospast Lamassary. There was something of great gray birds about them, silhouetted with hanging heads against the star-soaked sky. I don't know whether to say that they looked grief-stricken. Perhaps they were only upset. And it must be upsetting to be disturbed in the psychic activity inaccurately called forafeeling, the climax of metaphysical star roving. These old lamas whose home was among the star nebulae had lost their earthly home, the shrine of their profound paroxysms, their xenospasms. Their telluric base, where they could yield to their nostalgia for the infinite, had been taken from them. Their bodies were bent and crippled by astral arthritis. With their shoulders drawn up like wings, they looked like perching eagles. But their bodies were so gnarled that they resembled the twisted trunks of clipped willow trees. I didn't count them, there must have been 20 or more. They were all silent with the exception of one. This one was undoubtedly the most prominent, the chairman of the board, a man with a raw-boned face and heavy, half-closed eyelids. He had a soft voice and didn't move as he spoke. I call him the indifferent one, although I don't know whether he really was. At any rate, he didn't betray the slightest trace of sympathy. The indifference of the indifferent one almost looked like energy because it contrasted so sharply with the agitation of the agitated one who was shouting wildly at him and at the other xenospasts as he waved his long pointer around in the air. The agitated one was the only choleric type I had met among the restrained and reserved astromentals. Even in the gray neuter and in the minor intermundium he had been unable to curb his anger when his pupils indulged in nonsense. But the present agitation of our dear old elementary teacher was of quite different nature from his customary schoolmaster's ire, his quick, derisive resentment which merely concealed his offended good nature. His present agitation was of a deadly serious character, and its undertone was utter despair. Despite the chilly night beads of perspiration studded his smooth skull, his face was bluish and hollow, his eyes were red, and he ran up and down frantically without showing the distinguished xenospasts the respect that was due them. "Haven't I enough pupils?" he yelled, agile, supple lads who could slip through the eye of a needle? "There are Lorar and Lowhole, my best ones, my star pupils. Respondents and A1 Comet acrobats. There are Lowscram and 10 other advanced pupils, very smart boys, especially good in physical training, and tough fellows besides, whom I would send right straight through the sun globe or any other star without batting an eye. There are carrot. Why waste my breath? Am I the only elementary teacher? Aren't there 171 elementary classes besides my own? And among all those classes you had to pick mine, and among all my pupils you had to pick." "We didn't pick anyone," the indifferent one interrupted the agitated one. "The boy volunteered to sacrifice himself. The boy doesn't even know the meaning of the words volunteer and sacrifice. The boy doesn't know anything except the high spirits that go with his ability, and he's ready for any madcap prank." The indifferent one was unmoved. "The voluntary sacrifice will be no less great because it was made thoughtlessly or heedlessly. It shouldn't have been accepted," the teacher screamed. "The silly boy should have been put in a corner. But it was accepted," the calm voice murmured, "and the price of the sacrifice is truly great enough." The sacrifice will be in vain and the silly boy won't return. The chorus of the perching gray birds grunted, maybe he'll return, maybe he won't return. Just then the teacher recognized me, late enough, and rushed toward me. Help me, Seigneur, for God's sake help me, you know him. How can I help you? I said softly. I couldn't even help my friend. But you know the little fellow. I assume you're speaking of the graceful star dancer, the one with the nickname Low Run. The teacher looked at me silently and his eyes filled with tears. With a slow, despairing gesture he pointed to the crater, the smoke from which was getting thicker and thicker. In the tragic silence that followed this gesture the weary voice of the indifferent one rang dully. If the little fellow doesn't return, another one will go, and if he doesn't return, then still another one. But one of the little lizards will have to return and bring it up. The gray eagles on their perches feebly nodded the heads that projected from between hunched shoulders. I know that I'm nothing, the teacher wailed, less than nothing, for I never even got to be a star over, and for more than a century I've been jogging back and forth between the dull old planets. But there's one thing that I am with all my heart, and that's an educator. And as an educator I venture to ask the exalted navigators of the star nebulae, why doesn't the high floater come up himself and bring it with him? Why does a youthful life have to be sacrificed, a life that may itself be destined for the high floater's office? To this question, uttered in a tremulous tone, the imperturbable one replied, the high floater will not come up. He has refused to leave his office. Perhaps he has already fallen down from the vaulted ceiling and is no longer breathing. Another of the aged Xenaspasts broke the heavy veil of his silence and muttered, like all great personalities, our high floater has a bad character. He wants to keep the Isochronian for himself, nodded the neighbor of the one who had just spoken. Now the indifferent or imperturbable one said with unwanted emphasis, but we need the Isochronian, and on it we will found a new discipline. The word Isochronian was just mentioned. It is the last Greek loanword of my narrative, which unfortunately teems with such foreign words, and for its sake I must interrupt the tale once more. The interruption would be unnecessary if I were quite clear in my own mind about the Isochronian, which was sometimes also called the capsula. But TM not at all clear about it, and I have serious doubts whether a person who is bound to the normal consciousness of the 20th century can ever attain complete clarity about this thing. All I brought back with me was a strong presumption regarding this Isochronian based on concrete experience, an object that will be so important for the world of the future that the gentle forefeelers did not hesitate to send this boy into the molten hell of the Jebel to take it from the living or dead high floater. In keeping with my established principle, however, I refuse to parade my composite information as sure knowledge and to incorporate it in the plot of my story. On the other hand, I caught a glimpse of the capsula for a second and heard various intimations about it from the lips of the Xenaspasts, so that I feel quite certain that I am on the right track. In appearance, the Isochronian was a small, hexagonal metal capsule with a strap on each of its sides. It looked like one of the phylacteries or prayer boxes of the Jews, which are fastened to the forehead by means of straps or ribbons during prayer. What was inside the Isochronian is more than I can say, probably not words of prayers as in the phylacteries. Perhaps it was an inconceivably complicated formula, perhaps a drop of a sidereal essence, perhaps a grain of a drug procured from the world of star nebulae. How should I know? In any case, the contact of the Isochronian with a human forehead had a powerful effect on the spirit that dwelled behind that forehead. What kind of effect could it have been? In the Wintergarten, in the realm of cell division and of decay, we became acquainted with autobiological or heterochronic time. It was personal time, the private time of the single organism, detached from the general lapsing of time, the death-encircled time of the ego island. Linguistically, isochrony meant the opposite of heterochrony. Translated literally, isochrony meant merely simultaneity, in my opinion, the simultaneity of the universe, or more accurately, the simultaneity of all phenomena in the universe. What might be the meaning of the concept cosmic simultaneity? It means, if the reader will follow me, nothing at all inconceivable, nothing philosophically abstract. Yesterday, the high floater of the recently concluded era had divulged one of the world's secrets to my ears. The cosmos has the shape of man. Now, even if the shape of the cosmos man, the celestial man, does not correspond in every detail with ours, let us deal with the latter for a couple of minutes. Seen from the perspective of the moving systems of atoms that constitute it, our small body embraces well-nigh infinite time-spaces and space-time. We call one revolution of the Earth about the Sun a year. Let's call a corresponding revolution in an atom a year also. How many trillions of years lie between an atom in the sole of our foot and one in our scalp? And yet our body is simultaneous, contemporaneous in itself, but only as long as it lives, as long as it has a soul. When the soul departs, the body at once loses its simultaneity. It falls apart into billions of heterochronisms. In fact, death is really nothing but the conversion of isochrony into heterochrony, of the simultaneity of being into dissimultaneity. And at this point, if my hypothesis is correct, I approach the nature of the isochronian. The universe too, the cosmos man, the celestial man, had a soul, that is, his parts, though separated by trillions of years, were simultaneous and contemporaneous by virtue of will and consciousness. The isochronian appeared to be an instrument by means of which the automary consciousness of the earthman could be attuned to the universal consciousness of the celestial man, or in other words, the earthly. Tiny dissimultaneity of our lives could flow into the great simultaneity of the cosmos. For the initiate, therefore, who knew how to use the isochronian, there was no such thing as a sequence of events but only an endless coexistence, a simultaneity beyond all concept. At every instant his soul contained all associations and all continuities of nature, the fall of a linden leaf thousands of years ago and the explosion of a star millions of years hence. The isochronian, no matter what it contained, a formula, a drop, a grain, a scent, awakened the limited consciousness of the human to the omnipresence, the omniscience, the omniety of the celestial man. These concepts indeed contain the final goal of scientific endeavor, and it was quite clear to me why the gray indifferent ones spoke about adding a fourth chronosophic lamasery to the three existing ones, presumably the most inclusive and most splendid. I am convinced that my speculations about the isochronian are very near the truth. And still no one is capable of even imagining the utterly new and unknown things that lie beyond his own historical frontiers. We too, in the beginnings of mankind, were not entirely unfamiliar with this synchronization of the individual consciousness with the universal consciousness, this merging of man's heterochrony with cosmic isochrony. We called this phenomenon inspiration. To be sure, it occurred only like a flash of lightning, as the discharge of psychic voltage, a short circuit of the soul, so to speak, a sudden ecstasy, a heartbreaking transport, a vivid consciousness of unity. It left its faint traces in ideas, in poems, in melodies. But the chronosophers were not satisfied with fleeting inspiration. It might do for the authors of the Symphonion, but not for them. Their aim was a union of ego and cosmos subject to the will and permanent, a state that abolishes past and future, history and utopia, memory and foreboding, a state in which man will at last live in the dimensions that he claims to know best and really knows least, the present, the truest reality. As I sit at my desk, despairing of the power of language to transmit ideas, recording these significant words anent the mighty objectives of chronosophic science, I hear myself sigh, oh, how much easier my work on this travel report would be if I had the isochronian. For some time I stood lost in thought on the crystalline platform of the demolished Jebel. I only half noticed with a shade of disapproval that the aged four-feelers along the balustrade had turned around and were staring at the sky, where the uranographer was spelling out another announcement to the effect that the last of the conspirators had been disarmed a few minutes before. I was roused from my reverie by the teacher's heartrending cry, "There he is." When I first saw him, the boy was wrapped in clouds of smoke. I thought I could even see little flames which the teacher tried to smother with his own hands. It will always remain a mystery to me why the space-diving suit which the star dancer was wearing and which ordinarily resisted the most intense cosmic heat had not afforded him protection against a terrestrial fire. Only the vitreous helmet was undamaged. The space-proof material, on the other hand, hung down in charred shreds which the teacher at once began to tear from his favorite pupil's body. There was only one possible explanation. The thoughtless boy, accustomed to acrobatics in the intermundium and therefore disdaining what seemed to him a slight danger, must have neglected to seal the diving suit hermetically. His lithe body was covered from head to foot with horrible bumps. Laurent looked proudly at the four-feelers, made an awkward, adolescent bow, tried to speak, and collapsed in a dead faint. From his nerveless, seared, right hand dropped the isochronian, the metal capsule that contained the future of the human spirit, the price of his sacrifice. The 26th chapter, wherein I learned the other half of the truth from the lips of the Grand Bishop, and AM offered an unexpected accommodation for my return trip. They swathed the unconscious, moaning child in wet veils and laid him in my arms. I don't know why they chose me. Heavy as he was, I carried him. And I carried him along at a quick pace while hundreds of people followed. I recall that there was a considerable number of jungle peasants in the throng. The grief-stricken teacher never left my side and kept urging me to hurry. Maybe they had entrusted Laurent to me on account of the astromental superstition that I emitted some kind of primeval force. I was overcome with an indescribable mixture of pain and embarrassment whenever I looked down at the round, fever-reddened face and the tightly closed eyes. We hastened through one of the ruined gateways of the former East Side. We were headed for King Saul's house. Every child knew that the official Jew of the era was a medical practitioner whose ability and knowledge far exceeded the attainments of school medicine. It was only natural that school medicine, or body gardening chiefly restricted to prophylactic practice, had fallen into disrepute in an era of 180-year-olds without diseases who chose the voluntary road to the winter garden at the end of their lives. Body gardening attracted only subaltern types like the bath attendants in the winter garden, and they were not particularly well regarded. In the rare cases of a more serious illness or injury, the victim was ordinarily taken to the worker, or one of the animators was summoned to the surface, in strictest secrecy, of course. The greatest confidence in this sphere, however, was accorded Saul Minion Man and the other Minion Men, along with their sons and grandsons, as long as they were serious, timid, and gentle, in other words, not like Joel. That wasn't surprising, for Minion Man had the longest and most continuous experience with human suffering. And beyond that, he had focused his attention longer and more continuously than anyone else on suffering and had always lovingly identified himself with it. The teacher, for instance, firmly believed that Minion Man had magic powers at his disposal. It was shocking for me to see chronosophers who far excelled me in intellect and learning turn into helpless children in the face of suffering and death. "Hurry, Seigneur, hurry," he urged. "Lo Saul, he can do everything. He'll repair him in a jiffy." King Saul had not only taken down the sign, "Out Wandering," from his door, he was actually standing there himself, waiting for us with a sad and solemn mien. He had foreseen, no, he had seen everything. For fear of misunderstandings, I again run the risk of being a bore and repeat that this kind of seeing had nothing to do with any such clumsy, antiquated contraption as television. The astromental consciousness had long acquired the ability to tune in and to receive distant scenes and events. In this respect, astromental civilization was probably the forerunner of an even later, even more advanced stage, an isochronic civilization for which the boy in my arms was giving his life. But I didn't live to see that stage. The Jew of the era was standing between two of his grandsons. They were adolescent boys on the threshold of young manhood. They wore white burnouses, a not quite accurate designation which I have used before to describe the garb of the weary and heavy-laden. Both of them had restless, searching, black eyes and an embarrassed, gentle, somewhat loutish manner. They were Saul Minion Man's medical assistants. He had chosen and trained them for this purpose. His own golden darling, Joel, had never proved useful in this capacity. Minion Man's clan, incidentally, was sharply divided into two characteristic groups. The attention of both groups was continually centered on human suffering. The more inoffensive of these was concerned with the cure of curable suffering, the other, the more dangerous, with the restitution of incurably injured justice. Whenever a new Minion Man was born, his sire knew within a few days whether he belonged to the medically assuasive type or to the juridically querulous, a la Joel. The crowd that followed us, astromentals, jungle people, prolific families, weary and heavy-laden, had grown into the thousands. King Saul's eyes reflected a secret expression of fear and disgust at sight of the throng. He opened the wicket just wide enough for the teacher and me to slip through and then locked it at once. He didn't neglect, however, to replace the misleading little sign, "Out Wandering," under his nameplate. In the era of the travel puzzle, the concept of wandering was nonsense, of course, unless you were referring to willful inner absence. Saul led us into the depths of his house. We had to pass through a long suite of rooms crammed with junk before we reached a chamber which I shall frankly call the operating room. The illumination here was artificial, glaring super sunlight, reminiscent of the brilliance of John Evangelist. The room was empty except for a large vitreous table in the center. Astromental medicine, even Minion Man's traditional medicine, knew nothing of appliances, instruments, bottles, vials, tubes, rubber goods, or probes. The two adolescent assistants laid the unconscious boy on the table after they had first removed his wet veils with incredible tenderness. There he lay, covered from his neck to his feet with horrible second- and third-degree burns. I was cowardly enough to avert my eyes. For a long time Minion Man bent silently over the wounds, then he said, "The terrible thing is that I can't take away the pain." The planet teacher pleaded earnestly and naively, "Take the pain from him and give it to me." One of the grandsons had brought in a bowl of honey-like balm. Minion Man filled the hollows of his hands with the thick fluid and let it trickle gently on the wounds. The balm ran into the wounds in strange, searching driblets as though it were guided by its independent intelligence and will. Unhappily, the star dancer regained consciousness in the course of this treatment and began to whimper softly. But King Saul whispered to him in an inimitably persuasive manner. In a little while the boy quieted down and finally he said, "Gee, I thought it was going to be a real special acrobatic stunt and I was going to get a big thrill out of it." "What did I tell you?" the teacher exclaimed angrily without at the same time being able to control his sobs. "Nothing but nonsense and pranks and foolhardiness." Saul Minion Man looked at the pedagogue in surprise. "Have you ever heard of a heroic deed," he asked, "that wasn't done out of foolhardiness?" Despite the hellish pain, the boy tried to apologize. "I'm the smallest and the dumbest one in the class. I simply had to do it. A bigger one couldn't even have slipped through, not even Loscram." "Don't talk," King Saul warned him. But after a few panting breaths, Runt whispered, "And no one else could have gotten that thing out of the office." After these words he began to scream with unbearable pain. My gaze was fixed convulsively on Minion Man. "Will he live?" was the question in my eyes. The answer lay in Lo Saul's look and told everything, but his lips murmured, "The pain will soon pass." Meanwhile, the medical assistants had laid the boy on a light stretcher and had covered him with a cooling sheet that looked like oilcloth. Not a word was said, but they knew exactly what Minion Man wanted. The boy was struggling to speak again. "Teacher, teacher," he panted. The teacher kneeled down beside him. He tried hard to swallow his tears and to maintain the pedagogue's unemotional mien. "Here I am. What's on your mind, Runt, my boy? Will I have to write on the blackboard 100 times? I must not. Not 100 times, but 10,000 times, my dear boy. God will grant my prayer." "What happens now?" I asked Minion Man softly. "They will take him where he belongs." "And where does he belong?" "To his religion, to the union of his fathers." "I understand. You mean he is to be taken to the Grand Bishop?" Before King Saul could reply, we were interrupted. Lojol stood before us. Of all the momentous conversations that ever took place or will take place in human history, the one that ensued was undoubtedly the shortest. While the dialogue couldn't exactly be described as monosyllabic, it was the next thing to it, for each of the speakers uttered precisely 2 syllables. "Content?" asked Saul. "Partly," said Joel. The long-drawn, ponderous, yet derisive tone of Lo Saul's "content" seemed to contain many, many unspoken sentences. "Are you content and satisfied, son, that the overthrow you have been preaching for so long has finally come on us? The part you played in it, I know very well, wasn't particularly inspiring. An agent, an interpreter, a kibitzer. And what about the reforms? Who's been reformed? Your reformation is nothing but a dirty conglomeration. They've been humbled who deserve it, and they've been exalted who don't deserve it. Instead of miserable order, we have miserable disorder that will soon freeze into evil rigidity. And tomorrow the new will be the old, and you'll have reason to strive for a newer new. Content?" These were the approximate words that I deduced from the 2 syllables and from the dreamy, velvety, derisive glance of the father. Lojol, the son, was pale from loss of sleep. His lashless eyes were red, and freckles and blotches stood out on his albinotic skin. He had uttered his curt, partly with pedantic indifference and without looking at his father. He failed, however, to conceal from me a number of confessions and concessions which this partly contained. "I won't give you the satisfaction, you old Jew, of knowing that I'm licked. Even though TM is sick at my stomach as though I had been hit by a fulfillment disappointment. I won't give you the satisfaction of knowing that I trembled for your life all day today. Besides, nothing is lost if you're a realist and recognize people for what they are, namely a nasty mob who like nothing better than to see someone else in trouble. And I'm no better than the rest of them. That's why the world will have to be reformed some more even after the present reform. Long life change." This conversation lasted exactly as long as 4 drawled syllables. Lo Saul Minion Man straightened up and commanded his son with authority and dignity that brooked no contradiction. "Step behind me and follow me." The medical assistants picked up the stretcher with the boy. King Saul walked ahead. The teacher and I were at either side of the moaning child. Lojol followed. As we squeezed through the rooms crammed full of ancient memories, King Saul drew his cloak over his head and muttered a prayer of which an occasional strophe penetrated my consciousness. "Our Father, our King, I precede and I follow the bier of all eras of man. For eternal is thy grace that segregates me. Our Father, our King, they hate and despise me from Abraham to this day. They turn aside and look where I am not. For eternal is thy grace that segregates me. Our Father, our King, and yet I am their physician, and my son labors for their justice from Abraham to this day. For eternal is thy grace that segregates me. Our Father, our King, thou wilt end their troubles and give them peace on the day of all days. And then take thou me too, as the last, into thy peace. For eternal is thy grace that segregates me. These and other words of a hoary prayer chant struck my ear as from a great distance while our little procession stepped outdoors and passed through the small garden where the waxy flora of this advanced era listened anemically and the giant moths and dragonflies fluttered above our heads. The night was still very compact, but the ghostly bluish starlight was even more compact, and all the stars in the length and breadth of the heavens seemed to be working with breathless diligence on a spider web that was nothing but the growing consciousness of morning. The crowd in the former East Side had doubled. It had laid a hollow ring of silence around us in which nothing could be heard but the whimpering moans of the injured child. The Grand Bishop too was waiting, surrounded by his clergy. He was waiting outside the church whose illuminated green windows rose just above the surface. Some of the priests were carrying candles. It almost looked as though a nocturnal service had been interrupted, a penitential prayer or a procession. Nevertheless, the prelate was waiting for the dying star dancer in order that he might have the benefit of the final rites of the church. I am not in a position to render an authentic report on the relations of the Jebel and the church. I think it would be quite safe to say that their relations were not nearly as strained as those between the church and science about the middle of the 20th century. The dogma of the infinitely mobile central point of all conceivable orbits asterisk as well as Ursula's 27 paradoxes, only a few of which we had heard, constituted a bridge rather than a gulf between religion and science. Moreover, the church was not exactly what it had formerly been. As Joachim de Flores had predicted as early as the 13th century, it had long entered its third, permanent phase, the phase of the Ecclesia Spiritualis, the phase of the Holy Spirit, of the spiritual church. The fact that in recent times monastic orders like the Brothers of the Childlike Life or the Flock of the Poor in Spirit had gained high esteem could be regarded as a significant indication that the church was fighting against mentalism, intellectualism, and the danger of symbolic dissension within its own walls. The spiritual had developed in the direction of the intellectual and the intellectual in the direction of the spiritual. Between the two, however, stood the eternally impassable wall that separates belief from research. Even though the chronosophers were pure mystics, yet their bold voyages into space detracted from the heaven of the bishops, and in some respects they were more dangerous than the old-fashioned sophists, low-sum and low-clap, with their arguments about the existence or non-existence of God. A point in favor of the chronosophers, on the other hand, was the fact that they rejected the Wintergarten. The Grand Bishop's personal attention to the fatally injured sun dancer was an honor not so much accorded the ruined Jebel as the heroic self-sacrifice of a child. Such acts had become rare indeed in an era of extreme comfort and physical indolence. But maybe the prelate wanted to honor the Jebel after all because it had been transformed into a heap of ruins by brazen, insane fools. Wearing his mitre and vestments of delicate colors, the Grand Bishop strode toward us with upraised hands, followed by several priests. In the middle of his solemn approach, however, he stopped while the following interlude took place. Up to this point, I had hardly noticed that the boy's parents, mentally summoned, had been walking beside the stretcher for some time, a slender young man and a pretty little woman with gold headdresses, who scrupulously obeyed the rules of their civilization and gave no indication of grief even in the face of catastrophe. I really became aware of them only when I began to be irritated by their perfect composure. Such good manners at the bier of their dying child seemed like shocking coldness and heartlessness to me, the man from the ancient world whose soul was as full of cries of terror and grief as a Greek tragedy. Moreover, they continually leaned over the stretcher in their particularly elegant, transparent veils and talked pitilessly to the little fellow as though trying to persuade him of something. Every time this happened, his pain seemed to grow and he moaned louder. The teacher interfered in vain. When the Grand Bishop came in sight, the astromental couple coolly and decisively stopped the medical assistants carrying the stretcher, and all the rest of us, along with the huge throng that followed, were forced to stop too. This was the instant when the entirely unexpected incident occurred, an incident which, in my opinion, was unprecedented on the Earth's surface during the whole historical era of the Jebel and the Wintergarten. 3 white-clad figures pushed through the crowd to the cleared space in which we stood. One of them small and slightly deformed, the other 2 clumsy giants, real colossi on clay feet, like castrated harem guards. No, it wasn't our animator, at least it didn't look like him, nor were the others our bath attendants numbers 1 and 2. They were 2 other bath attendants, and they were dragging along a bathtub full of black soil that they had brought up from the depths of the Wintergarten. Thick, slow perspiration, like beads of wax, stood on their foreheads, for not only physical labor under the real sky but simply the sojourn on the Earth's surface was a hardship for officials of the Wintergarten. The teeth of all three of them, but particularly of the animator, were chattering with cold. The temperature of a normal spring night meant an Arctic adventure for them, and they undertook it only for the sake of the good cause. Out here in the open air, the animator apparently found it impossible to utter more than disconnected words. He kept pointing at the bathtub full of retrogenetic humus with an expansive, inviting gesture while he repeated two words over and over again: cool, good, cool, good. Laurent's father, a slender little man himself, straightened up to his full height, such as it was, and spoke with a loud voice that rang through the tense silence. My poor dear son, you remember the stories you were told when you were still a child, and you know who these men are and what this good cool bath is. It will heal your pain at once. You don't need further explanations. You are oriented. Oriented, the elementary teacher exclaimed in a mocking aside. He is a genius in orientation. The heavens aren't big enough for him to get lost. There was a long pause while the boy's attention returned from far, far away. Finally he asked in a faint voice that already seemed wrapped in sleep, "Is it time for me?" "It's time for all three of us, my darling," said the young woman without permitting a shade of grief to enter her tone. "Your dear mother is right," the man nodded. "We will lay you gently in the dark bath and your pain will vanish. Then we will conduct you to the place where they will lay us into the dark bath by your side. Thousands upon thousands have done it, many of our relatives and friends. And we three will be together. No more pain," the boy wailed. "Cool, good, the animator panted and pointed invitingly with both hands at the tub which was now standing directly beside the stretcher. Suddenly the star dancer became uneasy. His eyes searched. Teacher, here I am, my dear bad pupil. Teacher, what am I? Am I a chronosopher? Or am I still too young? I would never have said it before the wicked ears of the world / the teacher replied firmly. But now I will say it. In you, my youngest pupil, whom I shall no longer call Laurent, in you I see the high floater of the next. But the Jebel is gone, a sharp voice interrupted him. The dying boy had seized the teacher's hand and frantically tried to raise himself up. I don't want to be put where it's cool and where it's good, he cried. I don't want to. But think of your burning pain, his mother exclaimed, at last breaking into tears as she dropped to her knees. I'd rather have the burning pains, much rather. The boy gasped and sank back. His poor little breast rose and fell very rapidly. All those who had seen the incident and had understood it were moved to their very depths, so that the weeping of women, sobbing, blowing of noses, coughing, and sharp exclamations could be heard all around. Oremus, the Grand Bishop, chanted under his canopy as he slowly approached the dying child. A murmuring of prayers and responses came from the priests. Respice, Quirimus, Domini, Famulum tuum parvulum in infirmitate sui corporis. I hid my eyes. My throat was constricted by an almost inexpressible knowledge and feeling. In the reacceptance of natural death and pain by the little star dancer, a new future had taken the place of the old future. No wonder I became dizzy. It was a little too much for a single observer. But then I felt myself supported and led away by friendly arms. I was sitting in the Sephardrome, the Grand Bishop's library, in the same armchair as the time before. The same ancient quarto volume entitled Fortalicium Fidei, Strengthening of Faith, was still lying on the low table. It wasn't the original incunabulum, of course, but still it had attained a respectably hoary old age of several thousand years. A tall, graceful stem glass before me sparkled with the aromatic, hierarchical wine, the acquaintance of which I had already made. I must have consumed several glasses of it by this time, for despite the sick fatigue in my breast I had a confused, floating sensation of tranquility that mitigated my sorrow. When I looked up, the venerable Grand Bishop was sitting opposite me in his high-backed, throne-like chair. This time he was in mufti, that is, in ordinary black garb, very much like that of his clerical colleagues of 100,000 years ago. I collected my scattered wits and said, "It is very gracious of your lordship to grant me an audience at this hour and to extend me your hospitality. But it's not an audience that you want, my son. It's something quite different," and a faint smile illumined the prelate's large white face while his blue eyes rested calmly on me. "Certainly I want much more than an audience," I confessed. "You may be kind enough to recall that you once offered me a refuge in case of need. But the refuge was not accepted when the need arose." The Grand Bishop continued to smile, although his words were tinged with a mild reproach. "I admit that I was still too entangled and too curious yesterday. Moreover, I've always had a failing for interesting titles. The word Wintergarten exercised a magic attraction on me." "And now you are no longer entangled and curious?" the archpriest inquired, and a touch of amusement flickered through his serious question. Something forced me to bow my head. "No, your grace, I am no longer curious. Although your golden wine has comforted me a little, I am very, very sad. I have lost my best friend. And the child up there is dying or already dead. In that case, even my refuge won't do you any good, my son. Frankly, no. What then is the wish in your heart? Was it only yesterday, Señor Gran Obispo? Wasn't it much longer ago that you said to me, you have never been dead, sir? And you have never been dead, sir? Is that absolutely certain, Reverend Father? Considering your description of the state of being dead, which was as vivid as it was wrong, it is absolutely certain. But if I'm not dead, I am living. Am I right? Or is there still a third possibility? You are living. There's no doubt that you are living. And where am I living? Your lordship. I ask you the same question, my son. Where do you think you are living? Now and then in the course of my sojourn here, I have had sudden flashes of enlightenment on that point. Perhaps I'm living in a model world, a world patterned and reflected ahead of its time in accordance with one of the Ursula paradoxes regarding light orbits that create time and space of varying degrees and densities. Don't forget with whom you are speaking, my child. And now may I hear your request? I slowly drank the last few drops of my wine. I'm tired of it, I said, the glass still in my hand. I'm sick of it. I want to leave. You're tired of it. You want to leave. How do you expect to accomplish that? I came in through some kind of a gate or wicket. We ought to be able to find this wicket or another one like it. Wickets are out of my line, the Grand Bishop declared, obviously a little offended. It doesn't have to be a wicket or a gate, I hastened to amend. Any kind of passage will do. I simply can't go on living in two worlds any longer. My poor friend BH accused me of extending myself too far, of being so avid for experience that my existence is made up of nothing but antitheses. He says, in the first place, that's immoral, and in the second place, unhealthy. Your friend is right on two counts, the Grand Bishop nodded. I've lost my way and I haven't anyone but you. Most Reverend Father, to help me out of this confounded situation. I am asking you to help me. The Grand Bishop appeared to be reconciled, his large pale face was again smiling faintly. We shall think about it, he said. I don't deserve such kindness, I replied with a sigh of relief. My presence here has had no useful results, even if I am not aware of any conscious guilt. The Grand Bishop gave me a long, searching look. Your verbiage is as complicated as ever. Sir, that's because I am a great sinner and consequently always on the defensive in every sentence I speak. That doesn't make it any better, the archpriest shook his head sadly. No matter, we'll think it over. In fact, we've already given orders to think it over. You've taken a great load from my mind, your lordship. But now it must be time for me to withdraw in order not to disturb you any longer. It can't be long until morning. Oh no, my dear son, no rest for you now, the old man chuckled to himself. On the contrary, now you'll have to pay the price of our thinking. With pleasure. Whatever I can do is at your disposal. The Grand Bishop refilled my glass with great deliberation. The crystal hummed like a bell under the impact of the golden wine. I had longed for another drink but had not dared to ask for it. The price is not in excess of your capabilities, my child, said the reverend gentleman. I want to hear the sum of your impressions. Fortalicium fidei. I took the ancient volume in my hand and sniffed at it. The incense-like odor of old books hovered around my head. I leaned far back, closed my eyes, and began to speak. First of all, your lordship, my former vague belief in hereditary sin, in the fall of man through disobedience, has been greatly strengthened by the experiences of my visit. I was in a position to observe the inexplicable compulsion that tempts man again and again to destroy his hard-won equilibrium. In the present instance, it was even more insane and more incredible than ever before. But I'll go further than that. In the Jebel, they were kind enough to trust me with the solution of a few mysteries of the universe. I suspect that not only Adam, the earthman, fell from grace, but before him the celestial man, the first image of God. This seems to be a reasonable doctrine without, at the same time, vindicating our forefathers. The Grand Bishop's fingers drummed nervously on the arm of his chair and his eyes avoided mine. Who ever heard of a musician who liked to have a layman tell him about counterpoint, or of a theologian who enjoyed being frightened by a layman's metaphysical speculations which he recognized as refuted heresies and nothing more the minute he heard them? Confound that fellow Valentinus was the thought that probably ran through the Grand Bishop's mind. But what he said with a definite trace of annoyance was, "Let's stay on Earth, my son. You were very enthusiastic about a world without economics. Are you still of the same opinion? The world without economics is a paradise. But what's the use when man isn't paradisiac? He's the content which he pours into every form. And so all forms are immaterial in the end, since they always enclose the unvarying measure of human insufficiency. I don't know whether the caveman was happier than the denizen of a New York skyscraper around the year 1930 and whether the latter was happier than my host Lo Feijo in his subterranean house full of fancy light effects, dynamic wallpaper, family recipes prepared by a stellar process, and many other miracles. I only know that a skyscraper or a cottage around 1930 was infinitely more comfortable and more pleasant than the limestone cave of the troglodyte, and that the meanest homestead in Panopolis is incomparably more civilized than a millionaire's villa of my lifetime, not to mention the cloud-shrouded officieras and commerce canyons of Manhattan. Man has succeeded in making great improvements. No one but a stupid ignoramus can deny that. There's only one thing that he has not been able to improve, and that is himself. Very well said, murmured the Grand Bishop, reasonably well satisfied. On the whole, he seemed to be embarrassed and worried by my formulations. The world without economics, I resumed, stands higher than the world with economics, or rather, it is more highly developed, in the same way, for example, as an electric hotel kitchen is more highly developed than the open fire at which the savage roasted his hunk of buffalo meat, or as the preparations of the worker in their turn are more highly developed than the antique electric hotel kitchen. But it doesn't follow at all that the more highly developed food tastes better. In the long run, I would get very tired of the tricky mental soups and creams, and I'm pretty sure that a World Congress of Gourmets would vote in favor of a roast prepared over an open fire. So it seems to be an ironclad rule of life that every gain is based on a loss and vice versa. I hope that in spite of the victory of the jungle, the world without economics will be maintained. It's a better world even though man isn't any better in it. But even if man hasn't become any better morally, still he has become aesthetically more beautiful. He's not only become more beautiful but also more intuitive, and to make up for it, on the debit side, less emotional and colder. If man was formerly guiltily innocent, he is now innocently guilty with his vacant, unlined palms. As I thought of Lala in the village church, I fell into a protracted reverie so that I heard only the conclusion of what the Grand Bishop was saying to me. Get back home safely, people will ask you questions. Will your contemporaries believe everything that you will report truthfully to them? Many thanks. Your Lordship, I said gratefully, accepting another full glass. My contemporaries won't be particularly surprised to hear that the worker and his clan manufacture the simplified and intellectualized consumer's goods for the numerically reduced human race out of the rays of the sun and of other stars, and deliver these articles directly into the houses. The 20th century was the early and clumsy cradle of the later cosmic industry based on the utilization of stellar forces. The popular scientific journals of my lifetime already spoke glibly of alpha, beta, and gamma rays. The old-fashioned trans-shadow disintegrators hadn't as yet been invented, but the scientists were already on the track of the most primitive method of smashing certain atoms and of releasing the tremendous cosmic forces within them. Nor will, in my opinion, the institution of the Jebel meet with insurmountable skepticism. The more sensitive spirits of all times were aware that man's telluric consciousness would gradually have to develop into cosmic consciousness. I personally will be accused of cowardice because I only visited planets and ascended with the lowest grade in school instead of venturing into the higher and highest intermundia with the star rovers, marvelers, and forafeelers. And finally, as far as the Wintergarten is concerned, in spite of the lovely daisy fields, lots of people will be repelled and horrified by the Stygian locality and by the whole dirty, messy detour around dying. Just as I was. But who knows, there may be others who will not only find it credible but even practical, and who will be pleased with the idea of reversing life like a reel of film and running it backward from the end to the beginning. I hope, said the archpriest with a smile, that you are not overrating the willingness of your contemporaries, for I have no means of judging their reaction. But now tell me, my friend, what they will definitely not believe. They will definitely not believe, I replied, that your lordship and the Jew of the era exist. Why on earth shouldn't they believe this most modest of all facts? Simply because this most modest of all facts cannot be believed without belief in the supernatural. Unless you believe in the first, last, and final revelation of immutable truth through the Old and New Testament, the assumption that the Church of Christ and Israel have survived through the decamillennia is not only an old wives' tale but an offensive idea. Only very few of my contemporaries, however, have true faith in the supernatural. The rest of them will say, if all primitive religions have been supplanted by enlightened intellectual cognition, then the Church of Christ with its historically limited and conditioned mythologies and dogmas cannot possibly have survived in the face of such enlightenment. But won't the loyal Jews believe that they stood the test of time? The Grand Bishop asked with a clouded brow. A few devout Orthodox ones perhaps. They'll believe it, but they won't want to know it. The modern Jews, however, will be very angry over my report concerning Minyan Man and his son because their goal is nationalistic normalization, in other words, absorption. You exaggerate, my son. In the beginnings of mankind there were more good Christians than today. And these good Christians will be happy over your account. The Protestants and the nationalistic Christian denominations will hardly be pleased to hear that the Catholic Church won the race. But the Catholics? The Catholics will be deeply offended because I refer to your lordship as Grand Bishop instead of Archbishop, although the former is really correct since your pastoral duties extend over several major dioceses of Panopolis. I'm very sorry that you are going to get into difficulties if our thinking should have good results. The prelate did not finish his speech because a priest in the garb of a religious order had entered through a secret door. He was a tall, haggard man and he remained standing with his back to the book-covered wall like silence personified. In the first instant I took this shadowy individual for the father exorcist. But it wasn't he, although he belonged to the same order corresponding to the Dominicans of our time. The Grand Bishop rose. This, he said by way of introduction, is the reverend head of our angelological seminary. But I began to remonstrate, startled because I took the word angelological for a linguistic designation. The bishop noticed my misunderstanding and explained, "Oh, it's a venerable old institute, our seminary for research on angels." I almost clapped my hands with delight. "That's a field in which I've had some experience," I exclaimed, but quickly swallowed the rest of the sentence, for this was neither the time nor the place to speak about melangeloi and other phenomena occurring between this world and what he's outside. The Grand Bishop took the angelologist by the arm and they retired to a corner where they conversed in low tones. Although I felt that I and no one else was the subject of conversation and that it was my future that was being discussed, I didn't prick up my ears. An irresistible desire for another glass of wine, God knows how many I'd had, occupied my full attention. I couldn't restrain myself and I leered at the crystal jug like a thief, with a view to pouring out another glass surreptitiously. The priests had their backs turned to me. I reached stealthily for the jug. "It's the only accommodation," I heard the angel expert whisper. The word accommodation was used in the sense of a means of transportation. Stagecoaches and railroad trains used to be called accommodations. I held the jug cautiously in my hand. "I quite agree with you and it's entirely reasonable," the Grand Bishop answered in an undertone. The angelologist took a tiny book out of the pocket of his robe, held it close to his eyes, and began to turn pages. It looked as though he were thumbing the leaves of a timetable. People who turn pages of timetables always have worried expressions. I never looked at a timetable because I carefully avoid everything of a worrisome nature. I always stood by with cold indifference while others thumbed timetables for me, I, a naughty child of the railroad. This time too I was true to my nature. I brought the jug slowly nearer to my glass. And then I was caught in the act. The Grand Bishop turned around. "What is your exact address, my son?" he asked, and pretended he hadn't seen anything. "Number 610 North Bedford Drive," I replied smartly, blushing from my chin to my ears. "And is there a church in the vicinity of this address, or a chapel, or a shrine?" "That would be a help, and not only as a landmark," the Grand Bishop said and looked in the other direction, perhaps to give me an opportunity to fill my glass without further embarrassment. "Why, certainly," I exclaimed, anxious to please, "a pretty little Mexican church called the Good Shepherd. And right across the street from it is a lovely cactus garden." The Grand Bishop emphatically turned his back to me again. I poured out the wine but took only half a glass. Meanwhile I heard indistinct scraps of sentences. "A genius in orientation. Put him off at the corner of Bedford Drive and April 1943. I emptied my wine at a single swallow and gave no heed to the meaning of these shreds of conversation. Moreover, an attendant friar had entered the library by another door, had bowed deeply to the two reverend gentlemen, and had placed a large hourglass on the table, at the same time murmuring the words, "It is finished." The half-glassful of wine was precisely half a glass too much. My head began to spin. An unspeakable sorrow rose in my throat. I knew what was finished and who had finished it. At the same time, however, a word that the Grand Bishop had uttered at the time of our first meeting began to rotate in my brain and torment me. It sometimes happens in the deep of night, in a trough of the sea between waves of sleep, that some word, some action that was accepted uncritically during the day is glaringly revealed as a lie, as a piece of faithlessness that sinks its poisoned fangs deeply into our suffering soul. The words of the Grand Bishop now affected me in the same way. Yet I was not suffering on my own account but on account of the boy, the dead boy, who had just finished his part up there. No, I couldn't remain silent, no matter how late it was and no matter how sedately the room spun about me. The Grand Bishop had dismissed the angel expert with his timetable and had stepped back to his throne without, however, making a move to sit down. I too was therefore required to rise. I haven't gotten to the most important point, I stammered. The archpriest raised the hourglass from the table and looked at it. Most of the sand had slipped away. You have only a very few minutes, my son, he warned, just as many as lie between imprisonment and release. And if I had only a single minute, I can't help it. You told me that the world here and now is more wicked, more sinful, more distant from God by 100,000 years than it was at my time. If that is true, no one can go on living, I can't go on living. Did I really say that? The Grand Bishop asked with a smile. You said it. You said it. Then I told you a half-truth. A Grand Bishop does not speak a half-truth. Quite right, my child. But it may happen that a Grand Bishop speaks only half of the truth. But what is the other half? The bishop's large white face, beaming with pure friendliness, came closer and closer to me. The other half of the truth is very simple, my son. We are not only alienated from God through the lapse of time, but are also brought nearer to God through the lapse of time. That is because we are moving farther and farther away from the beginning of all things and closer to the end of all things. And now I had an experience similar to the one on John Evangelist when I had learned in the face of the ninefold brilliance of the sun that the energy of a star could be greater than itself. The room no longer whirled about me, and a spiritual happiness without parallel filled my consciousness with ecstasy. Today, I no longer understand with the same clearness and intensity what I understood at that moment. I understood that we are moving from warmth into cold and at the same time from cold into warmth, from light into darkness and at the same time from darkness into light. This incomprehensible dual movement is the movement of the history of man and the history of mankind. The straight line of time bows before its creator in a reverential curve in every one of its seconds. And so we are safe because alienation is nothing but a form of approach. The Grand Bishop had placed the hourglass on the table. I hardly noticed that he took me by the hand and that we were ascending the toilsome staircase of the ascetics, slowly, laboriously, as I had ascended it once before. The new day had not dawned yet, but it could not be far off. In a few minutes the sun would rise. The heavens were saturated with light, but the pale morning star and 2 other planets were still visible. How well I knew these stars in the cozy little universe that is ours. And now we emerged in the cool morning air. And now my feet were planted for the last time on the iron-gray sod of the astromental era of mankind. The next thing I saw was the distant, serried throng surrounding the empty space in front of the church in a wide circle, astromentals and jungle people indiscriminately mixed. The red tassel caps flamed like blood spots among the undulating veils. But what was that? I didn't trust my ears. It was singing, hesitant, childlike, unison singing, a simple chorale from all sides. The jungle people were giving the astromental highbrows their first singing lesson. A good idea. Every loss is a gain. It sounded very thin and schoolboyish. It sounded like singing after a long illness. And then I caught sight of the dead boy. He was lying on a plain, narrow bier. His head was raised fairly high. His graceful body had been covered with a veil. At his feet the teacher had collapsed and had fallen asleep. At the head end of the bier a few of the oldest foreign feelers stood as a guard of honor, among them the imperturbable one with the isochronian bound to his forehead. I recognized it because the capsule gleamed like a mirror in the dawnlight. The parents had left. Undoubtedly they were in the winter garden by this time. I looked at the Grand Bishop inquiringly. He had stopped walking and stood before me, a much larger and more impressive figure than I had thought. With a rhythmic motion he made the sign of a great cross over my head. Then he made a gesture of dismissal. I knew I had nothing else to do but go. A distance of perhaps 30 paces lay between me and the dead boy. As I took the first few steps I was uncertain and afraid that I might spoil everything by a false step or false thought. The following thought, for example, ran through my mind and I didn't know whether I was permitted to think it. He fetched the isochronian from the depths because he himself is the isochronian, the simultaneity of the world. On the other hand, it suddenly dawned on me what all the whispering in the Grand Bishop's library had meant and why they had asked for my address. It meant that Lowrun had been commissioned to put me off or to throw me out at the corner of Bedford Drive in April 1943, for in order to get to the end of our cozy little universe he would have to fly back to the beginning. And Bedford Drive was located somewhere in the first quarter or first third, counting from the beginning. Very interesting, I said to myself as I strode along more rapidly and more confidently while the childlike, timid choir of untrained voices wove a veil over me. I could plainly see the face of the dead child. But it wasn't one face, there were 2 faces. Confounded astigmatism. Where are my glasses? I felt through all the pockets of the dress coat for my glasses, although I knew very well that they had been taken from me. But there really were two boyish faces superimposed one over the other, a gray, dead face on top and a blooming, smiling one underneath, just as a gray membrane half conceals the gay colors of a decalcomania. The gray face became more and more indistinct and the smiling one more and more distinct the closer I approached. No nonsense now, my boy, or, with the help of God, all the nonsense you please, my entire being chuckled within me. And my entire being was light, bright, airy joy, the very memory of which brings tears to my eyes. Now the smile of the star dancer was very near me. He had hoodwinked them all, for between the half-opened eyelids I saw his roguish glance. And into this glance I strode until I knew nothing more. The end.